What if angels once bled, not metaphorically, not wings and harps and clouds, but real living flesh? Beings of light who crossed a forbidden boundary and left behind children. Children whose descendants may still walk among us. For centuries, whispers have trailed through cloisters and catacombs, through censored texts and midnight confessions of a sacred bloodline, too divine for man, too dangerous for the Church. And if such a lineage truly exists, one question still echoes louder than any prayer. Why has the Vatican spent over 1,000 years trying to erase it? Let the hum of the world fade now. Set your thoughts aside. The candles are lit. The past is waiting. In this quiet, we will trace the invisible thread that binds angels to the sons of men and uncover the secret they never wanted spoken aloud. Picture a parchment yellowed by time, sealed in wax with a forgotten symbol. Somewhere beneath Vatican City, in a vault deeper than the catacombs that document may still exist. It doesn't carry a saint's sermon or a forgotten decree. It holds a name believed to be descended from something not quite human. Stories of divine bloodlines aren't new. Pharaohs claimed it. Emperors insisted on it. Even medieval kings boasted of holy veins. But this story is older, stranger, quieter. It belongs not to royalty but to silence, hidden in the margins of apocryphal texts, masked in the parables of forbidden gospels, swallowed by the dust of inquisitorial fires. And at its heart is a claim so radical, so destabilizing, that it threatened the very foundations of the Church. The archangels, not symbols, not messengers, but incarnate flesh and blood beings, may have fathered a lineage. And the Vatican may have spent centuries ensuring that no one ever found it. This is not a conspiracy tale told in the dark corners of the internet. This is a slow unraveling of centuries-old threads, historical facts, suppressed texts, coded frescoes, and erased names. You will not find clear answers here, only echoes, hints, shards of a truth too radiant to face directly, but once glimpsed impossible to forget. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Section 2. Echoes from Eden. Was there another line? It always begins in a garden. Not just any garden, but Eden, that green cradle of myth and mystery, where the divine once walked alongside man, or so the story goes. But the further one peers into the creases of old scripture, the less Eden seems like a storybook paradise and more like a stage, a place where something unspeakable happened, something not fully recorded. Because between the trees of life and knowledge there may have been a trespasser, and in the aftermath of that encounter, a second bloodline may have bloomed, one not born of Adam, but of something else entirely. Genesis, in its sanctioned form, is sparse. Adam, Eve, a serpent, a fall, but ancient texts that didn't survive canonization or were forcibly removed from it tell a messier tale. In some versions, Eve doesn't merely speak with the serpent, she mates with him. And in older Jewish mystical traditions, the serpent isn't just a creature, but a being luminous, articulate, seductive. Some call him Samael, others simply call him the angel who fell. Whatever the name, the implication is, the same humanity's beginning may have included a union not between man and woman, but between human and angel. Even in texts that survived, oddities abound. Cain, for instance, is born first, but Adam's direct paternity is never explicitly stated. In fact, a few early Christian sects whispered that Cain bore the mark of something alien, something divine, or infernal. The Church understandably shut this idea down with the subtlety of a hammer. But fragments survive. In Gnostic scriptures, Cain is not a murderer, but a misunderstood bearer of hidden knowledge. a vessel perhaps of a forbidden spark. Fast forward to the apocryphal life of Adam and Eve, a text popular in the early centuries of the Church. Here we find Eve recounting that it was not the serpent who deceived her, but an angel in radiant form. This detail, easily dismissed as allegory, takes on a new weight when paired with other sources that hint at physical union between angels and humans. The thread is faint, yes, but it runs through centuries of suppressed belief that Eve may have borne more than just Adam's children, that there were twins in Eden, one human, one other. It's a story the Vatican has had to contend with quietly. In the late 13th century, a scholar named Petrus Comastor was reprimanded for proposing that Eve's offspring included a line touched by heaven. His writings were swiftly condemned and most copies burned. But a few monastic copies survived, hidden in the folds of Benedictine archives and forgotten towers. In one, he described the notion that the first woman was entwined with a force of radiance and that her child bore the vision of two worlds. What does that even mean? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. This theory isn't merely theological heresy. It's genealogical heresy. If even part of it is true, then the accepted descent of mankind from a single pair is not just incomplete, it's wrong. More than that, it suggests a lineage hidden from history, sidelined, scrubbed from genealogies, persecuted into extinction or secrecy. Modern genetics offers an unexpected twist. Mitochondrial Eve, a term coined in the late 20th century, refers to the most recent common matrilineal ancestor of all living humans. But even that title is misleading. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time. Others existed, their lines simply didn't survive. Or perhaps some suggest their lines survived in ways we can't yet measure. Non-coding DNA, epigenetic anomalies, traits that appear in families with no traceable origin. Certain rare blood types, for instance, that baffle researchers. The Rh null phenotype, known as golden blood, appears in less than 50 people worldwide and resists explanation. And then there's the cultural residue. Across civilizations, Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, there are legends of beings who descended from the sky and gave birth to priest kings and prophets. Always male, always luminous, always falling. These aren't coincidences, they're echoes. The question is of what you might wonder why this matters, why dusty scrolls and vanished scholars should trouble us now. But if there was a second line born in Eden, its descendants would have carried a legacy never written in the Book of Life. And that legacy, threatening to both theological and political structures, might explain why the Church became so obsessed with controlling texts, lineages, and even blood. An obscure 10th century chronicle from an Irish monk named Gilla Patrick contains a peculiar entry. He writes of a family blessed with dreams of fire, whose eldest son would always be born with silver hair until the age of 10, after which it would darken. No physical records of such a trait exist today, but the monk's language is clear. They are said to carry the shimmer of heaven. The shimmer. That's not a word you expect from a medieval scribe, not unless he was trying very carefully to say something he wasn't allowed to say. The Vatican, of course, says nothing, but it watches. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly the Holy Office, formerly the Inquisition, has always had agents tasked with monitoring spiritual anomalies. Their archives are off limits even to most clergy. Yet over the years, rare leaks have occurred. A report from 1947 refers to a woman in northern France whose blood glowed faintly under certain frequencies. The report was marked Divina Stirpe, of divine stock, and sealed. So was there another line born in Eden 1, not of clay, but of light, the scholars argue. The texts whisper, the science shrugs. But as we wander deeper into this shadowed forest of possibility, one truth becomes clear: if such a bloodline ever existed, it would explain the Church's deepest fear and its most persistent silence. There is a single verse, just one, tucked deep in Genesis, nestled between genealogies and pre-flood warnings, and yet it might be the most explosive line in all of Scripture. Genesis 6:4. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives, whomever they chose. That's it. No elaboration. No follow-up. The line passes by like a shadow on the wall, easy to miss, even easier to ignore. But to those who read with cautious eyes, it's a thunderclap. Because in that simple phrasing lies the possibility of an unholy union, one that may have produced beings of immense power and of unacceptable origin. The term sons of God has caused theological migraines for centuries. Some have argued quite conveniently that it simply refers to the descendants of Seth, Adam's so-called righteous son. Others, however, especially ancient Hebrew and early Christian writers, interpreted it far more literally. These were not men. These were divine beings, angels, watchers. Those who were never meant to cross into the realm of flesh, and certainly never meant to leave descendants behind. The Nephilim, that rare and strange word, is used to describe their offspring, often translated as giants, though the Hebrew root implies something closer to those who fall or those who cause others to fall. In some traditions, they're titanic warriors. In others, spiritual hybrids with dangerous knowledge. But always they are a disruption, an anomaly, an echo of something heaven tried to bury and earth could not contain. The Book of Enoch, long excluded from the official biblical canon, but cherished by early Jewish mystics and Ethiopian Christians, paints a detailed and uncomfortable portrait. In its pages, a group of angels called the Watchers descend to Mount Hermon. There they swear a pact to take human wives. They teach forbidden knowledge, astrology, metallurgy, enchantments, and their children giants with appetites that defy nature. These are not bedtime stories. They are warnings, records perhaps of a time when heaven itself fractured. The Church's response to these tales has been curiously inconsistent. Enoch was quoted by early Church fathers, including Tertullian and Clement. But as orthodoxy solidified, the book was quietly dropped. Its visions of angelic lust and divine miscegenation were simply too dangerous. The Council of Laodicea in the 4th century ensured its exclusion, and with it, the story of the Watchers and their children was locked away. But not completely. Hints survived. In the writings of the Essenes, hidden in the caves of Qumran, fragments of Enoch rest beside psalms and prophecies. And among those fragments lies the terrifying idea that the blood of angels did not simply vanish after the flood. It lingered in the bones of kings, in the visions of prophets, and perhaps in the veins of a few who walk unseen among us. A curious case emerges in the writings of Flavius Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian of the 1st century. He references the giants of old, describing their bones as visible in his own time and their strength as legendary. Josephus was no mystic. He wrote for emperors, and yet he seemed convinced that something once walked the earth, which was neither fully man nor fully divine. The Church, ever adept at managing uncomfortable truths, reinterpreted these verses as allegory. The sons of God became noble lineages, the Nephilim mere metaphors for fallen morality. But the problem with metaphor is that it doesn't leave skeletons. And yet here and there, giant femurs have surfaced, often in places tied to ancient Semitic cultures, too large for any modern human, dismissed always as misidentified fossils, but never studied long, always, quietly removed. By the Middle Ages, the Nephilim had transformed into demonic archetypes, not descendants of angels, but instruments of Satan. The shift was clever. It buried the celestial scandal under infernal theatrics. A few medieval scholars, however, resisted. One manuscript, now housed in the Vatican's secret archives and known only by its catalog number, Codex R383, contains marginalia from a 13th century monk named Brother Elric. In a barely legible hand, he writes, "They were not of hell, but of heaven's rebellion. Their blood remains waiting. The entry is unsigned, the ink faded, but someone kept it." Modern scholars, of course, prefer less colorful interpretations. Many dismiss the Nephilim as mythological noise, the kind of spiritual overgrowth that accumulates over centuries. But even among these skeptics, the question persists: why include such a verse at all? Why leave a breadcrumb trail if it leads nowhere? It may be that the verse remains because it cannot be erased. Too many scrolls, too many echoes, too much risk in removing it completely. So instead, the church surrounded it with silence. No sermons on it, no feasts, no stained glass, just a shadow. This silence becomes more curious when you consider how often similar stories appear elsewhere. In Mesopotamian myth, the Apkallu semi-divine sages interbred with humans before the flood. In Greek lore, gods routinely descended and fathered heroes. Gilgamesh, Heracles, Perseus, all part divine, all part human, always powerful, always tragic, always watched. So here's the open question. Are these myths variations on the same truth? A truth so deeply embedded in human memory that it surfaces again and again in different tongues and temples? And if so, why did the Church alone find it necessary to censor rather than celebrate such divine ancestry? Perhaps because this was no ordinary divinity. Perhaps because these weren't gods in the poetic sense, but beings whose very presence destabilized theology. Beings who broke rules, who loved, who bled, and who left behind a lineage that could never be acknowledged without breaking the spine of dogma. The Nephilim may be long gone, or not. If their blood still moves through human veins, it does so quietly, hidden in plain sight, whispered through anomalies, mutations, uncanny brilliance. Maybe it lives in those who see too much, dream too vividly, or move through the world with an ache they can't explain. What is certain is this: the sons of God and the daughters of man were not meant to mix. But they did. And the world has never truly recovered. There's a kind of tremor that runs through history moments when truth flares for a second before being buried again under centuries of doctrine. The Book of Enoch is one such flare. A text so ancient, so audacious that it nearly reshaped how humanity understood its own beginnings. And then suddenly it vanished, declared heretical, sealed away, and replaced by a comfortable silence. But the story it told refused to die. Because inside those fragile pages was a record of the unthinkable angels who defied heaven, descended to earth, and created a race that was never meant to exist. Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, is mentioned briefly in the Bible. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. A strange little phrase that suggests something closer to ascension than death. But in the book that bears his name, that walk becomes an odyssey. Enoch is lifted into the heavens by the archangels and shown the mechanics of creation, the order of stars, and the rebellion of the Watchers, a group of angels who could not resist the beauty of human women. Their leader Semjaza makes a pact with 200 others. Together they descend to earth, take wives, and father the Nephilim, hybrid beings of immense size and forbidden knowledge. It would be easy to dismiss this as myth, If not for one inconvenient fact, the Book of Enoch predates many of the canonical texts that quote from it. Jude 1:14 even references it directly. Early church fathers like Tertullian and Justin Martyr cited it as legitimate scripture, and yet by the 4th century it had disappeared from the Western Bible entirely. It wasn't until 1773 when the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia with 3 copies of the Ge'ez translation that Europe saw the text again. It had survived only because the Ethiopian Orthodox Church never stopped reading it. Their priests still chant its verses today as though guarding a secret the rest of the world was told to forget. So why was it banned? The official answer is theological inconsistency. But the deeper reason seems simpler: fear. The Book of Enoch doesn't just depict angels as spiritual messengers. It portrays them as physical beings capable of lust, corruption, and instruction. They teach humanity the secrets of the heavens, astronomy, metallurgy, the art of writing charms. In other words, they give mankind divine knowledge without divine permission. And in doing so, they challenge the monopoly of heaven itself. The story implies that human civilization, its tools, its intellect, its beauty, may have come not from God, but from those who rebelled against him. That implication changes everything. If Enoch's vision is true, then the line between divine and human is not a wall, but a doorway, one that was forced open long ago and never fully closed. No wonder the Church couldn't let it stand. No hierarchy survives the claim that angels once mingled with mortals and shared their blood. It undermines the very architecture of faith, which depends on separation, heaven above earth, below angels, there humans here. Enoch burned that separation to ash. Buried inside the text are small, haunting details that seem too specific for allegory. When the Watchers descend, Enoch names the mountain. They land on Hermon, now located near the borders of Syria and Lebanon. Archaeologists have found ancient temples there, predating Abraham, their altars, aligned to constellations described in Enoch's visions. On one basalt tablet, a nearly erased inscription mentions beings shining like the dawn. Local shepherds still call that region Jabal Harun, the mountain of the shining ones. Coincidence, perhaps? Or memory turned to myth? The Vatican's relationship with Enoch has always been uneasy. In the 16th century, Jesuit scholar Benito Pereira reportedly found fragments of a Latin translation in the papal library. His notes, later confiscated, mention a record of angelic fornication of creatures called the Eljoim, who mixed their seed with man. Eljoim, a corruption of Elohim, the Hebrew name for God. That single slip of the pen may reveal how close he came to something forbidden. The Vatican's own catalog lists the text as De Perditum lost. Conveniently. Even stranger are modern traces. In 1948, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, fragments of Enoch were among them. Carbon dating confirmed their antiquity, over 2,000 years old. The fragments matched almost perfectly with the Ethiopian version, suggesting the story had survived untouched. Yet despite its authenticity, the Church still excludes it from the canon. Officially, because it does not align with the spirit of divine revelation. Unofficially, perhaps because it reveals too much. A faint parallel emerges in ancient Sumerian texts. The Anunnaki deities who descend from the heavens to instruct mankind mirror the Watchers in nearly every respect. They too are punished for sharing knowledge. They too produce hybrid offspring, and in one late tablet from the city of Ur there's mention of a flood to cleanse the seed of the sky. A different language, a different culture, but the same idea that divine blood entered the human line and needed to be erased. You can almost hear the irony that the flood presented as divine judgment might also have been a cover-up, a cleansing not just of sin, but of evidence. If Enoch's story is more than myth, then the survivors of the flood, Noah's family, may have carried with them traces of that celestial inheritance. And if that's true, the flood didn't end the bloodline. It merely hid it in plain sight. There's an obscure footnote buried in a 19th century Vatican inventory labeled Liber Prohibitus XIII. It refers to a manuscript confiscated in Naples described as a continuation of Enoch recounting that some of the watchers repented and took flesh among men, once more seeking to purify their offspring. That page too is missing now, but the phrasing "took flesh" once more lingers like a whisper, because it suggests the watchers didn't vanish. They returned. What unsettles theologians most about Enoch is not the idea of sin, but of continuity. If angels once interbred with humanity, then some trace of that union might still remain. Not metaphorically, genetically, which would mean that divine essence, diluted but unbroken, could still pulse in human blood. The Church's silence then becomes understandable. How do you shepherd a flock that might in part be divine? So the Book of Enoch endures outside the walls of Rome, passed down through whispers and apocrypha, through heretics and dreamers. Every rediscovery, every translation feels less like archaeology and more like rebellion. Perhaps that's why it still draws seekers today, not because it tells us about angels, but because it dares to tell us we might be their children. Long before the serpent slithered, before Eve tasted anything forbidden, there was a fall. Not from innocence, but from allegiance. From obedience to desire. His name, at least the one that remained after the Vatican scrubbed his myth into metaphor, was Samael. Not quite Satan, not quite Lucifer, something stranger. In the oldest layers of Jewish mysticism, Samael was the angel of death, but also the seducer of Eve. Not in a spiritual sense, in a physical one. The Church never liked Samael. He was too complicated, too gray. Not the embodiment of pure evil, but a being tasked with divine justice who slowly drifted from his station. And in some apocryphal texts, he did more than drift. He descended, fully, to the garden, to her. The Zohar, a foundational text of Jewish Kabbalah, contains a troubling passage. It describes Samael as both the serpent and the one who came unto her, meaning Eve, in a form that was not repulsive but radiant, not scaly and forked-tongued, but beautiful, golden, almost royal. The sin of Eden in this version wasn't a fruit. It was knowledge of another kind. Flesh meeting flesh. The first taboo. And from that union came not just knowledge, but blood, living blood, that would carry a spark of heaven and a shadow of exile. The implications are terrifying if you're a theologian trying to preserve a strict division between heaven and earth. But they are strangely poetic if you're a storyteller or someone hunting for a lost lineage. Because if Samael was truly the father of Cain, as some ancient rabbis suggested, then the first murder wasn't just fratricide. It was a divine bloodline trying to erase itself. Cain, as you may recall, was marked. No one really knows what that means. Interpretations range from physical disfigurement to glowing skin. But the mark served one purpose: it warned others not to touch him. Who exactly would be capable of harming Cain if he was the only human besides his parents and brother? The math doesn't work unless there were others. Unless Cain wasn't merely human. Medieval mystics took this further. They speculated that Cain's line, supposedly wiped out in the flood, actually mingled with Noah's family. Not overtly, quietly. Through Nama, the wife of Ham, whom some Kabbalistic texts describe as a descendant of Cain. This Nama is different from the Nama in Genesis, but the names blur across sources, and through her a whisper of angelic fire may have survived the deluge. Which brings us to the Vatican's problem. If a rogue angel like Samael really did mate with Eve, then the entire framework of salvation becomes unstable. Who is Jesus saving if humanity isn't entirely human? Who are the sons of Adam and who are something else? The Book of Jubilees, another banned text, speaks of spirits born of such unions who walk the earth unseen, influencing the hearts of men. Some believe this was the origin of the concept of demons. But what if they weren't evil? What if they were just miscategorized liminal? Neither heaven nor earth, children of a forbidden love. In the 12th century, a scholar named Michael Psellos, writing from the Byzantine court, mentioned a class of beings he called Noera Zoa thinking animals. He wasn't referring to beasts. He was referring to people who exhibited traits that could not be explained by normal means. Unusual strength, premonitions, eyes that reflected light in the dark. He speculated rather boldly that these individuals might be remnants of the angelic strain. Psellos's work was quickly absorbed into the Church's forbidden index. But traces remain, even in art. One of the lesser-known frescoes in the Basilica of San Clemente in Rome shows Eve and the serpent. But look closely. The serpent has a human torso. His eyes are sorrowful. He touches Eve's hand not like a deceiver but like a lover. The fresco is unsigned, attributed only to a monk of uncertain loyalties. It has never been reproduced in catechisms. The light in the chapel is deliberately dim. It's easy to miss. And maybe that's the point. Not to erase, but to blur. To let the story survive in shadow, deniable but undeniable. There's an obscure folktale from Galicia passed down through Jewish families during the Middle Ages about a girl born with silver eyes. Her parents claimed she was cursed, but the village rabbi insisted she was a bas malach, a daughter of an angel. She vanished in a fire before she turned 12. Some say it was an accident. Others say the Church arrived first. The Vatican would never comment, of course. But internal correspondence from 1311 uncovered during a brief archival breach in the early 2000s references a female anomaly of mixed origin in the northern provinces, followed by a chilling addendum remedied. The term mixed origin is key here. It suggests that somewhere someone is still keeping track of the blood. Not metaphorically, but genealogically. Perhaps there's a ledger, perhaps a map, but more likely there's just silence. Deep humming institutional silence. It might explain the Church's obsession with saints' relics, bones, hair, teeth, objects that could be tested, catalogued, compared. What if they weren't preserving holiness but preserving samples? What if some of those saints weren't just pious but genetically anomalous? And this leads us back to Samael. Not as a devil, but as a diverging point in human history. A figure who refused to remain in his place, who stepped across the divide not to destroy, but to touch, to love, maybe even to create. The Church calls it sin. Others might call it the origin of something extraordinary. Either way, the result is the same. A bloodline begins, one that shouldn't exist, one that carries the scent of heaven and the stain of disobedience. And in every generation, someone tries to snuff it out. She is called Theotokos, the God-bearer, the virgin, the untouched. But rarely is she called what she might also have been, the vessel of a bloodline not entirely earthly. Mary, Mother of Jesus, is often framed as a passive figure, chosen, blessed, obedient. Yet beneath the golden halos and folded hands lies a genealogy so tangled, so strangely edited, that it demands closer scrutiny. Because if Jesus was born of both divine and human substance, as the Church teaches, then Mary's blood was not merely clean, it may have been prepared. The official genealogies in the Gospels focus curiously on Joseph the man who wasn't biologically involved. Matthew and Luke offer two competing family trees, each tracing back to David, but diverging wildly along the way. Mary's line is rarely mentioned explicitly, and yet early Christian Apocrypha tells a different story, one that centers her ancestry not on royal descent alone, but on something deeper, something veiled, the Proto-Evangelium of James. A 2nd century text rejected by the Vatican tells us that Mary was born to Joachim and Anna, an elderly couple previously thought barren. Her conception is treated as miraculous, not quite a virgin birth, but unusually sanctified. She is presented to the temple at age 3 and lives there until puberty, attended by angels and fed not by priests, but by divine hand. The implication: Mary wasn't just holy. She was set apart from birth, prepared. But, for what one possibility whispered among certain medieval mystics is that Mary's womb was genetically unique. Not in a metaphorical chosen by God kind of way, but biologically distinct. A late 14th century commentary by Hildegard of Bingen, tucked into the margins of a larger theological volume, refers to the vessel whose blood did not war with light. That's a strange phrase and one likely to get you excommunicated, unless of course you hide it in Latin metaphors and botanical illustrations, which Hildegard did. Clever woman. Some modern scholars have speculated that Mary may have belonged to a priestly caste, not from David, but from Aaron, a Levite like her cousin Elizabeth. That alone upends the traditional narrative. But others go further, pointing to texts like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus performs miracles as a child, not just because of divine power, but because his mother's blood knew no error. Again, strange phrasing. Again, quietly discarded by church authority. Even stranger is the presence of angelic visitations to women in her family line. Elizabeth is visited. So is Anna, Mary's mother. And Mary, of course, is greeted by Gabriel not with fear, but familiarity. The text in Luke says, "Hail, full of grace." The word in Greek is kecheritomene, meaning perfectly graced, a state completed before the greeting, which implies she was already different, already aligned. Some Gnostic sects, especially the Valentinian branch, believed Mary carried the seed of the aeons, a spark from the realm of light. They didn't deny her humanity. They questioned its boundaries. One Gnostic hymn, "The Thunder Perfect Mind," features a divine feminine voice proclaiming, "I am the one who gave birth and yet did not labor." These lines were considered heretical, banned, and nearly lost until rediscovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945. Their tone is haunting, defiant, not of a meek virgin, but of a divine carrier. The Vatican has always struggled with how much to deify Mary without unraveling the doctrine of her humanity. They elevated her through the Immaculate Conception, the idea that she was born without original sin. But they've never explained why such a thing was necessary. The dogma states she was preserved to be a worthy vessel, but stops short of exploring what that means biologically. If Jesus needed a sinless womb, does that imply sin or something else is transmitted through blood? There is an odd clue buried in the writings of Pope Pius IX, who formalized the doctrine in 1854. In a draft sermon that was never delivered, he wrote of Mary as she who bore the light not by miracle alone, but by conquered, harmony, unity. It's as if he knew that something in her makeup harmonized with the divine spark, that she was not simply chosen, but compatible. And if she was compatible, then we must ask with what or with whom. The deeper you dig, the more you find whispers of bloodlines, not just blessings. In Eastern Orthodox icons, Mary is sometimes depicted with stars on her shoulders and forehead, symbols of her cosmic alignment. One rare mosaic in the Kora Church of Istanbul shows her holding Jesus, but behind her, subtly woven into the gold tesserae, is a six-winged seraph. No caption, no explanation, just presence, watching. Historians often chalk this up to artistic license, but iconographers of the period worked under strict theological guidance. Nothing was unintentional. Which raises a peculiar possibility: was the presence of the seraph an admission, a hint, that Mary's lineage was not entirely terrestrial? Let's return briefly to the arch-null blood type, golden blood. Fewer than 50 people have it. It lacks all arch-antigens. It's universally accepted by anyone, yet can only receive from its own. A genetic isolate, a statistical ghost. One French case from the 1970s involved a woman who gave birth to 3 children each with a slightly different but related blood anomaly. The case was flagged by the French National Institute of Health, and strangely, a Jesuit biologist was involved in the analysis. No papers were published. The records were transferred to a private archive. That archive no longer exists. Coincidence, maybe. But if someone were tracking rare bloodlines not for disease but for divinity, this is how they'd do it. Quietly. In labs, in hospitals, in back-channel collaboration with religious institutions that have a vested interest in keeping the data out of public hands. So we ask again, who was Mary not in legend? In flesh. Was she simply holy, or was she designed not by experiment, but by long, slow cultivation, a bloodline traced back to the angel who first fell, or perhaps the one who chose not to? Because if Mary carried a trace of something divine, something inherited rather than bestowed, then Jesus didn't just arrive as a miracle. He arrived as a culmination, a convergence, a bloodline made flesh. He appears without warning, no footsteps, no rustling robes. Just light, the Archangel Gabriel. For most, his role is clear divine messenger. A voice from the heavens tasked with one purpose: to announce. But there is something strange about his mission to Mary. Something too detailed, too direct, too deliberate. The language in Luke is crisp, clinical even. Not a poetic proclamation, but an instruction. A delivery protocol. And behind that heavenly greeting lies an unsettling possibility. Gabriel's message was not merely verbal, it was biological. Gabriel speaks to Mary with a familiarity that has puzzled theologians for centuries. Do not be afraid, he says, a standard angelic opener, sure. But then he continues, you have found favor with God. Not will find, not are about to receive. Have found, the past perfect tense. The implication is that something has already been observed, already chosen, already verified. What if Gabriel wasn't just announcing a birth? What if he was confirming a sequence, a pairing long in motion, prepared generations in advance? In medieval mystic circles, particularly among the Beguines and the Rhineland visionaries, Gabriel was considered more than just a herald. He was believed to be the steward of celestial genetics, a kind of heavenly archivist who preserved the memory of divine bloodlines. Some texts even suggested that Gabriel carried the echo of first light, a poetic way of saying he remembered what God once planted in mortal veins. That memory passed through time was said to manifest as a radiance without origin in certain individuals. Mary's encounter with Gabriel carries hallmarks of a contact event, not unlike those found in other ancient mythologies. In Sumerian texts, messengers of the gods arrive in whirlwinds and beams. In Zoroastrianism, the Yazatas descend with blazing light and leave behind chosen women who bear sons of immense power. Gabriel fits neatly into this archetype, but his precision, his almost surgical language stands apart. There's an obscure Syriac manuscript from the 6th century called the Chronicle of Serapion, preserved now only in fragments. In it, the writer claims Gabriel bore not only words, but essence a euphemism that has launched dozens of scholarly debates. Some interpret it as spiritual. Others more daringly read it as literal, that Gabriel was not simply delivering a message but executing a protocol. That he may have been, in whatever form angels may truly take, a mechanism of insemination. Too sci-fi, perhaps. But one must ask why the Gospels go to such lengths to emphasize that Mary was a virgin. Theologically, yes, it establishes divine paternity. But biologically, it introduces questions. The Holy Spirit is said to come upon her, but no further detail is given. In ancient Jewish culture, spirit and breath were often interchangeable words used to describe unseen but active forces. Forces capable of creation. And if we return to Gabriel, there's another appearance worth noting: Daniel. In the Old Testament, Gabriel visits the prophet to explain a vision, one that involves 70 weeks and the coming of the Anointed One. But the timeline is obscure, full of numbers and riddles. Why Gabriel? Why that prophecy? Why in the cosmic library of divine messengers is he the one always tied to birth, to timelines, to genetic continuity? Perhaps Gabriel isn't just a voice. Perhaps he's a keyholder, one who activates something dormant. The overlap is too specific to ignore. He visits Daniel to speak of messianic timelines. He visits Zechariah to announce John the Baptist's birth. He visits Mary to announce Jesus. In all three cases, the womb is involved, a hidden code being unsealed. A 12th century monk named Laurentius of Tours recorded a vision in which Gabriel stood at the foot of a tree whose roots ran red with fire. When asked what the tree was, Gabriel replied, "It is the line that must not be broken." The monk was later silenced by his abbot, and his writings nearly lost. But one fragment survived, tucked into the margins of a psalter. It reads, "He is not messenger, but gardener." That's a metaphor heavy with implication. Gardeners don't merely announce the fruit. They plant the seeds. They prepare the soil. They trim what does not belong. What if Gabriel's presence throughout history is not episodic but continuous? What if he has always been watching, guiding, pruning the human tree to preserve a single hidden strand? This would make Gabriel not just an agent of God, but an architect, a kind of divine genealogist safeguarding the fragile flame of something long lost, something forbidden. The bloodline. The Gospel of Luke, written with suspicious precision, includes genealogical data no carpenter's family would require. Names stretching back through David, through Abraham, all the way to Adam. But also to God. The final link. Some argue this is symbolic. Others suggest it points to a hidden heritage, one that Gabriel was sent to monitor, maybe even preserve. Of course, the Vatican has never acknowledged Gabriel as anything more than a messenger. But in the Vatican Library's Codex 1167, a banned collection of early Christian visions, an anonymous text titled "The Blooming Star" describes Gabriel as the one who opens the lock of flesh to receive the fire of heaven. It's not clear whether this was meant as poetic allegory or precise description. But either way, the metaphor is hard to ignore. In 1998, an Italian geneticist named Dr. Alessandro Ratti published a now-suppressed study on rare mitochondrial mutations found in a cluster of women living near Nazareth. The mutations were subtle, irregular recombination patterns that didn't follow standard maternal inheritance. The study was pulled within weeks. The funding disappeared. Dr. Ratti relocated to Argentina and has not published since. He was last seen consulting with a theological institute in Córdoba, one known for its ties to the Jesuits. So was Gabriel simply delivering good news to Mary? Or was he activating a lineage thousands of years in the making? Was his mission one of words or of code? Whatever the truth, Gabriel is the common denominator in every sacred birth. He hovers on the threshold of every divine emergence. And if the archangels were ever tasked with safeguarding their own descendants, with ensuring the survival of a secret bloodline, then perhaps his role has never ended. Perhaps Gabriel still walks among us. Two family trees, one man, and an inconsistency so blatant, so oddly placed, that it almost begs to be ignored or studied obsessively. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke both present lineages of Jesus tracing his descent back to King David and beyond. But here's the twist: the names don't match. Entirely different paths, different fathers, different branches, and yet both are presented as truth. For theologians, it's a scribal glitch. For historians, a literary device. But for those chasing the scent of a forbidden bloodline, it's a rupture, a fingerprint, a clue. Matthew begins his list with Abraham and moves forward, naming 42 generations leading to Jesus, placing Joseph as the son of Jacob. Luke, on the other hand, starts with Jesus and traces backward all the way to Adam and beyond, ending with the Son of God. But he names Joseph as the son of Heli, not Jacob. So which is it? There are, of course, elegant explanations. Perhaps one traces Mary's lineage, the other Joseph's. Perhaps levirate marriage caused some confusion in the records. But the contradictions remain glaring, and for a church that constructed its authority on the precision of lineage, these errors seem purposeful, or perhaps protective. What if both genealogies are correct and yet incomplete? What if each is a distorted echo of something that couldn't be written outright, a hidden sequence obscured by history, designed to mask a truth too destabilizing to record in plain ink, that Jesus descended not only from human kings, but from something older, something other. Some early Christian sects, particularly the Abionites and the Elkazites, held radically different views of Jesus' origin. They believed that his divinity did not arrive at birth, but was activated later, perhaps at baptism, perhaps even earlier at conception. They also speculated that Mary herself descended from a line of light, and that Jesus' inheritance was not just royal, but celestial. These sects were quickly labeled heretical. Their writings burned, but fragments survived in the commentaries of their opponents, traces left like fingerprints on the backs of burning scrolls. One curious artifact housed in the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, a tattered papyrus dated to the 3rd century, contains a side-by-side comparison of Matthew's and Luke's genealogies. Next to each name, someone has written tiny symbols, stars, wings, serpents. The meaning is unclear, but among scholars who've seen it, the consensus is chilling. The symbols suggest a code, a classification system, not of royal descent, but of bloodlines, hybridity, possibly even divine markers. And then there's the apocryphal genealogy of the Redeemer mentioned in passing by Epiphanius of Salamis in the 4th century. According to his critique, this lost document contained names not found in any canonical list, including several female ancestors who were said to be daughters of the Watchers. The text was condemned and never recovered. But the implication is staggering. Not only was the genealogy of Jesus considered flexible, it may have once acknowledged links to angelic progenitors. This raises a haunting question. Was the confusion between Matthew and Luke's genealogies a scribal accident or a smokescreen? Were the evangelists encoding multiple layers of ancestry, one visible to the untrained eye, the other only to those who knew what to look for? One particularly obscure text from the Nag Hammadi library, titled The Thought of Nerea, speaks of a lineage preserved through women, a hidden matrilineal thread beginning in the days of the Watchers. Nerea in this version is a descendant of Eve's other child, not Cain or Abel, but Seth, and she carries within her a spark that the archons seek to extinguish. That spark, according to the text, re-emerges every few generations in a chosen woman. Some have speculated that Mary was one such re-emergence, and Jesus the ignition. The idea of dual genealogies also appears in Kabbalistic texts, particularly in the Sefer HaBahir, which hints at two trees of descent, one of earth, one of light. The latter is not written in scrolls, but in flesh, in traits, in the voice, the eyes, the soul's clarity. A strand passed not through kingship, but through resonance. It is this idea of resonance that may explain why so many were drawn to Jesus, not for his teachings alone, but for his presence. Something in him unsettled, even before he spoke. Pontius Pilate, according to an ancient Syriac tradition, trembled upon meeting him and claimed his blood is not of this world. The quote is apocryphal, of course, but it reflects a deeper myth that those who encountered him sensed something else. In 1932, a French priest named Père Lambert reportedly gained access to a now sealed Vatican vault containing early Christian codices recovered from Syria. In his private notes, leaked decades later by a student, he wrote, "There is an entire shelf labeled Descensus Sanguinis containing genealogical speculation unfit for public faith." He never elaborated. But descensus sanguinis means the descent of the blood, not of faith, of lineage. And then we have the mystery of Melchizedek, the high priest, who blesses Abraham and is called without father or mother, without genealogy. The author of Hebrews makes the comparison Jesus is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, not the order of Levi, not of Aaron, but of someone untraceable, someone outside human descent. Was this poetic language, or was it a clue? If Melchizedek was an incarnate angel, a divine being who walked the earth and left no mortal trace, then aligning Jesus with his order could be read as a statement of genetic alignment, of inherited essence, a veiled acknowledgement that the Messiah came from a bloodline not recognized by human scribes, but recorded perhaps by watchers. And so we're left with two family trees and 1,000 silences. The Church urges us not to dwell on these inconsistencies, but that very discomfort speaks volumes. If the bloodline of Jesus cannot be charted, or if it leads somewhere dangerous, then obfuscation becomes protection. Not just for doctrine, but for those who still carry a spark of that forbidden inheritance. A spark that might still be passed, not through scrolls, but through blood. The very idea sounds like heresy. That archangels, those towering beings of light and fire, could descend into flesh, take human form, and walk unnoticed among mortals. It defies doctrine, upends centuries of metaphysical hierarchy. Angels are messengers, not incarnate beings. They appear in dreams, vanish in smoke, never bleed. At least that's the official position. But history, inconvenient as always, tells another story, one smuggled through forbidden texts, whispered among early sects, and ultimately buried beneath centuries of theological cement. A story that suggests the divine was not merely among us, but of us. The idea didn't begin in shadow. In the earliest Christian centuries, multiple sects openly speculated that archangels could take on human form, not just temporarily, but fully enduringly. The Ebionites, the Nazarenes, and even some Gnostic schools believed that certain angels were not separate from creation, but deeply woven into it. They held that beings like Gabriel or Michael had at various times inhabited the flesh, either by divine command or as part of a celestial rebellion. These incarnations weren't symbolic, they were historical, real. One tantalizing fragment from the Acts of Andrew and Matthias describes a strange visitor, A man dressed in white who walks through walls, speaks every language, and disappears after whispering a name no one remembers. He leaves behind no footprints, only a ring. In later texts, the figure is identified as Mikael of the Earthborn. The implication is staggering. If this was the Archangel Michael, then the distinction between heavenly messenger and embodied agent vanishes. He wasn't just visiting, he was inhabiting. The Church understandably was horrified by these claims. The Council of Constantinople in 553 formally denounced the belief that angels could possess flesh. It wasn't just doctrinally problematic, it was politically volatile. If angels could incarnate, they could sire offspring. If they could sire offspring, then lineages could form. And if those lineages survived, the Vatican would have no monopoly on divine legitimacy. Authority would have to compete with ancestry. Yet despite condemnation, the idea refused to die. It resurfaced again and again in art and folklore. In medieval France, stories abounded of men of no shadow, strangers who healed the sick, spoke no known language, and vanished when cornered. In Bavaria, a cathedral mosaic dating to the 1100s shows the Archangel Raphael embracing a mortal woman beneath a veil of stars. The caption, nearly rubbed away by time, once read, "Unio lux et terra," the union of light and earth. More damning are the texts that were actively hunted and destroyed. The Gospel of Bartholomew, now lost, except in slivers quoted by its detractors, reportedly contained a passage in which Jesus tells his disciples that Michael once walked among them in sandals as your brother. If true, this would suggest the early church once entertained or even accepted the idea of embodied archangels, not illusions, not visions. Beings of flesh, heartbeat, and breath. There is also the matter of angelic titles. The name Gabriel in Hebrew means, God is my strength. Michael, who is like God, Raphael, God heals. But these aren't just names. They're mission statements, identities. If the archangels existed only as spirits, why give them tasks tied to human needs, strength, healing, guidance, unless those tasks required presence, unless at some point they had to be here? A 15th century mystic, Lady Sibylla of Bruges, claimed in her visions that the archangels were not voices, but veiled bodies passing among us, touching the world like wind through cloth. She wrote of one who came to her in the marketplace, bought bread, and then vanished after uttering her childhood nickname, one no one else had ever known. Her visions were dismissed, her writings burned. But in 1892, a German archivist cataloging monastic garbage found a single page of her diary preserved between panels of discarded altar wood. On it, she had drawn a man with 6 wings hidden beneath a cloak. The caption read, "He walks still." The idea of angelic incarnation even reached the Renaissance, though only in cryptic allegory. In Botticelli's Mystic Nativity, a painting flooded with symbols, 3 figures in white embrace mortals beneath a sky of angels. The angels are descending, not hovering. Their feet touch the ground. Their expressions are solemn, almost human. Art historians call it poetic license. Others call it memory. And then there's the case of the Silent Brother. In 1727, a mute man appeared at the gates of a Jesuit monastery in Portugal. He carried no documents, bore no known accent, and refused all food for 7 days. When he finally spoke, it was to recite Psalm 91 in perfect Aramaic, a language no one had spoken in over a millennium. He died 2 weeks later, never identified. The Jesuit sealed his possessions, but not before a young monk copied a phrase found etched inside the man's ring, quod est angelus in carne. What is angel in flesh? The incident is recorded in the monastery's private annals, but has never appeared in any public church documentation. So we return to the central question: if angels could become flesh, Why would they? One answer might be curiosity, another punishment. But a third, and perhaps most troubling, is preservation. A bloodline once begun needs protection, guidance, shepherding, perhaps even participation. If the Archangels were the originators of a forbidden lineage, they might also be its stewards, guardians walking the earth not with swords, but with skin. This would explain the strange pattern of sightings, the disappearances, the reappearances, why certain individuals, always unnamed, always elusive, show up at pivotal moments in history, perform a single act of mercy or insight, and vanish again. Not saints, not prophets, something older, something quieter. Of course, none of this can be proven. That's the point. Heresy can only survive in whispers. But for those who listen closely to the cracks in the Gospels, to the vanishing ink of outlawed scrolls, to the stories too strange to be fiction, a pattern emerges. It looks like flesh, but it moves like light. Buried beneath centuries of orthodoxy lies a name the Church tried to forget. Sophia. She is not mentioned in homilies or painted in cathedral ceilings, yet in the labyrinthine texts of the Gnostics, those early Christian mystics exiled for asking the wrong questions, Sophia is everything. Wisdom embodied, the divine feminine, the spark that fell from heaven. And if her fall mirrored the descent of the Watchers, then it's possible that what she carried with her was more than metaphor. She may have fallen with something alive, a seed, not just of knowledge, but of blood. The Gnostic creation myth diverges sharply from the Genesis account. In their cosmology, the world was not formed in perfection, but in error. A divine being, Sophia reaches beyond her place in the pleroma, the heavenly fullness, and births a flawed god, Yaldabaoth, the demiurge. He is ignorant, proud, and violent. In his arrogance, he creates the material world, believing himself to be the only deity. But Sophia watches, grieves, and hides herself within creation, not as a ghost, but as a presence scattered in the souls and blood of humanity. To the Church Fathers, this was dangerous nonsense, but the Gnostics believed it fervently. In their view, salvation wasn't about obedience, it was about awakening. Realizing that inside every person lived a shard of divine light. That light came from Sophia. It was passed not by ritual, but by lineage, and it would bloom when touched by truth. The Pistis Sophia, one of the most extensive surviving Gnostic texts, describes Sophia's descent into the lower realms, her sorrow, and her entrapment in matter. She cries out to the highest light for redemption. But redemption in this story does not arrive in the form of judgment. It comes through birth, through generations of bodies, through bloodlines carrying fragments of her essence, until one child born of both light and clay remembers. Some scholars have quietly proposed that this child is not metaphorical, that the Gnostics were preserving the memory of an actual bloodline, one infused with divine spark, passed down through the maternal line, often hidden, sometimes extinguished, occasionally reawakened. A bloodline, Sophia began, and if that's true, then Mary may have been more than chosen. She may have been a culmination, the final flowering of Sophia's long-buried seed. The Catholic Church has always avoided the subject of divine femininity. Mary is venerated, yes, but always as a vessel, never as a source. Yet the Gnostic writings insist otherwise. They portray Mary Magdalene as the true apostle, the one who understood Jesus not only as a teacher, but as one who recognized the spark in her. In the Gospel of Mary, a suppressed text from the Nag Hammadi library, Magdalene comforts the disciples not with platitudes, but with visions. She speaks of the child of light and of the soul's journey through hostile powers, archons, that attempt to extinguish the divine within. There's a line in that gospel I saw him in a vision, and he said, "Blessed are you who did not waver at the sight of me. For where the seed of light is there, I will be also." It's cryptic, but if taken literally, it suggests that divinity recognized itself in her not as a gift, but as kin. Modern scholars have tried to domesticate these stories. They speak of metaphor of ancient allegory. But if you examine the language closely, there's a biological undertone. The Gnostics were obsessed with blood, with birth, with embodiment. The trimorphic Protonoia, another esoteric text, speaks of the seed, which was hidden in the image, and which has never ceased from generation to generation. That's not allegory. That's inheritance. There's also the issue of secrecy. Gnostic communities were notoriously selective. Initiation required silence, loyalty, and often blood ties. In one account found in the Acts of Thomas, a group of followers live in a secluded valley guarding a scroll said to contain the names of those born of Sophia's line. No copies were permitted. Only oral transmission. The location of the valley was never revealed, but some believe it lies in northern Syria near Mount Kasiyun, long considered a sacred site. Oddly enough, church military campaigns during the Crusades paid disproportionate attention to that area. Officially for strategic reasons. But some suspect otherwise. The Vatican predictably has never commented on Sophia. The name appears nowhere in canon law. But an internal memo from 1963 leaked during a brief window of archival exposure referred to a persistent Gnostic framework influencing Marian theology. The memo warned of a resurgence of Sophia-based narratives in fringe scholarship and recommended quiet suppression through redirection of devotional language. In short, give the faithful enough mystery to keep them engaged, but never enough to make them question the foundations. And yet the foundations continue to crack. In 2006, a private symposium at the Pontifical Gregorian University addressed the growing academic interest in divine femininity. One presentation, later redacted, focused on gynocentric Christology, proposing that Jesus' humanity was specifically calibrated to match a maternal lineage carrying a unique spiritual trait. The presenter, a German theologian, was reassigned 6 months later to a remote parish in the Black Forest. His paper has not been published. All of this leads us back to Sophia and her seed. If the Gnostics were right, if a divine feminine essence entered the world not by accident, but by design, then the bloodline we are following may not begin with Eve alone. It may begin with Sophia's fall, with her longing, with her choice to bury light in the bones of humanity, trusting that one day someone would remember. And if someone did remember, if someone was born carrying not just the memory, but the genetic echo of that light, then the Church's silence becomes something more than defensive. It becomes fear. Beneath the opulence of St. Peter's Basilica, behind locked iron gates and guarded corridors, lies the Vatican Apostolic Archive, often called the Secret Archive. Though secret is something of a misnomer, it's not a hidden room full of shadowy monks hunched over cursed scrolls. No, it's a labyrinth of carefully catalogued history, a library of humanity's most guarded knowledge. Over 53 miles of shelving, nearly 2 million documents, and somewhere within those countless manuscripts, or so it is whispered, lies a single codex hand-bound in red leather, marked with a sigil no one will explain. A book that dares to trace the bloodline of angels. They call it the Codex Lux Aeternum, the Book of Eternal Light. The name appears in only 2 known places: an 1894 inventory ledger written by a French Jesuit archivist, and a footnote in a suppressed Vatican internal report from 1948 regarding anomalous genealogical speculation. Neither document describes the contents directly, but both refer to the Codex as non-canonical, theologically unstable, and potentially incendiary. The kind of language the Church only uses when it's trying very hard not to say too much. Whispers about the Codex began centuries earlier. In the 15th century, a scholar named Bartolomeo da Modena was excommunicated for claiming to have read a book in the papal library that proved divine lineage among mortals. He was tried for heresy and died in a prison cell beneath Castel Sant'Angelo. But in his final letter, smuggled to a fellow scholar, he wrote, "They walk among us still the children of the bright ones. The blood sings, the book sings louder." That phrase, "the blood sings," has since become a kind of code among esoteric researchers searching for traces of divine descent. Access to the archive is limited. Even cardinals require permission. Most scholars are granted access to just a handful of documents after years of petitioning. And the deeper levels off-limits entirely. These sub-archives contain materials deemed too sensitive for even most church officials. During World War II, Nazi officers petitioned the Vatican for access to occult documents rumored to reside there. The Vatican refused. But what were the Nazis looking for? And why did they believe such texts existed? One theory suggests that Codex Lux Aeternum contains genealogical charts, mapping the descendants of the Watchers and their unions with human women, a kind of celestial registry. Not allegory, but actual names, families, bloodlines, perhaps even modern ones. If such a book existed, it would be catastrophic. Not just for faith, but for power. Imagine a living person whose ancestry could be traced to divine beings. Imagine how governments, militaries, or even corporations would treat such a person. A leaked 17th century Vatican memo refers to a line of illumined blood allegedly protected by a secret wing of the Jesuits. This memo, now preserved in fragments within a sealed collection in Krakow, describes a protocol for identifying individuals of unusual spiritual resonance, those who show an inherent attunement to sacred geometry, harmonic frequencies, and intuitive insight beyond statistical norms. It sounds like nonsense. Until you learn that the memo also references physical traits, increased sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, dreams that correspond to astronomical events, rare blood types. One particular footnote in the 1894 ledger stands out. The archivist writes, "The codex is to remain sealed unless the return is confirmed. Its predictions extend to the blood's reawakening." That phrase, "the return," appears elsewhere in esoteric literature, always tied to prophecies about the re-emergence of angelic essence in humanity. But the word predictions implies something far more concrete. Was the Codex not just a record, but a prophecy? An old Vatican legend, known only in obscure clerical circles, tells of a pope who descended into the archive one evening and emerged pale, shaking, unwilling to speak. He would resign within a year. Some say he found the Codex and read something meant only for eyes no longer human. Others claim he saw his own name in the book not as a pontiff, but as a descendant. That man was Pope Benedict IX, whose 3 separate papacies in the 11th century remain one of the strangest anomalies in church history. He was excommunicated, reinstated, resigned under pressure, and was ultimately accused of crimes unfit for ink. Yet despite the scandal, many of his writings were preserved, sealed in the same archive that still houses the Codex. Could it be that the Church has not only tracked this bloodline, but quietly protected it or manipulated it? A Vatican directive from 1965 references active monitoring of deviation strains in lineages bearing anomalous spiritual influence. That's diplomatic speak for bloodline surveillance. Who are these families? What deviation are they monitoring? And why is it classified under the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly known as the Inquisition? Further clues lie in the archive's restrictions on certain medieval genealogies. Researchers have long noted that documents pertaining to specific noble lines, especially those connected to the Merovingians, the Byzantine emperors, or early Levantine dynasties, are inexplicably redacted or require months of clearance. Entire family trees are marked with black bars. Occasionally, a name is replaced with a single symbol, a wing, a flame, or the Latin letter L. It would be laughable if it weren't so systematic. Perhaps the most unnerving testimony comes from an anonymous former Swiss guard, published in a rare 1997 Journal of Religious Dissent. The guard, whose identity remains unverified, described seeing a cardinal enter the archive late at night, accompanied by two men in civilian clothes. They carried a single key gold, engraved with an 8-pointed star. When they returned, one man reportedly wept. The other did not speak at all. The cardinal was dead within the year officially of heart failure. Unofficially, well, no one asked. And so the codex remains sealed. Or does it? Some believe it was removed during the chaos of World War II, spirited away to a Jesuit safe house in South America. Others say it never existed at all, a fiction born of centuries of paranoia and coded language. But the pattern persists. Silence followed by redaction. Rumor followed by denial. Still, the ledger exists. The memo exists. The fragments scattered like breadcrumbs persist, and where there are breadcrumbs, there is always something trying to be found. In the ancient city of Constantinople, where golden domes once rose over streets paved with prophecy and paranoia, the rulers of Byzantium believed they were not just heirs to Rome, but to heaven. The imperial throne was not merely a seat of earthly power. It was a pedestal lifted toward the divine, a claim not of blood, but of light. And in some corners of the empire, especially behind the heavy doors of the sacred palace, there were hushed beliefs that the emperor's right to rule came from more than lineage. It came from a spark passed down through generations. A spark not of man, but of angel. This wasn't some mere metaphor. Among certain elite circles of the Byzantine court, it was quietly understood that select emperors descended from a line believed to trace back not to Adam, not to David, but to a union between an angel and a human woman centuries before the Christ. A dangerous belief, a thrilling one never written in law, but carefully protected in ritual architecture and myth. The Byzantine emperors were obsessed with bloodlines. Every coronation, every marriage alliance, every palace intrigue turned on questions of legitimacy. But unlike their Western counterparts, they infused this legitimacy with divine mystery. Their rituals were almost liturgical. The emperor was known as Isapostolos, equal to the apostles, and more than once as Porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, referencing the sacred birth chamber, lined with imperial purple marble, meant to sanctify the newborn's very flesh. But what if the color purple wasn't the only thing sanctifying the child? There's a tantalizing thread in the writings of George Synkellis, a 9th-century court chronicler. He writes of Emperor Heraclius, a complex figure who recaptured Jerusalem from the Persians, as bearing the star-born trait gleaming in his youth. Historians usually dismiss this as poetic flourish, but the phrase star-born appears in only one other known Byzantine document, a now fragmented genealogy carved into a slab of porphyry discovered beneath the ruins of the Blachernae Palace in 1924. The carving lists 14 names, some historical, others unknown. Beside each is a mark, a stylized wing with 7 feathers. The slab was removed, stored, eventually lost. But the rumors persisted. that certain noble families in Byzantium claimed descent from an angelic visitation predating Constantine, that this bloodline was kept secret passed only through daughters, that children of this line were marked at birth not with deformity, but with brilliance, pale eyes that shimmered in torchlight, blood that clotted more slowly, a resistance to certain illnesses, and sometimes dreams that came true. The Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian, was long whispered to possess such traits. She rose from scandal, and the theater not places where saintly legends usually begin, and yet she was revered, feared, obeyed. One court rumor recorded by the historian Procopius in the Secret History claims that Theodora once stood untouched in a burning room. The fire consumed the drapes and floorboards, but stopped at her hem. She emerged with soot on her cheeks, her skin unburned. Superstition, maybe, or maybe something else. Several Byzantine emperors were buried with peculiar rites. Instead of standard Christian sacraments, some funerals included readings from apocryphal texts, especially the Book of the Watchers, a segment of Enoch. This was considered heresy by Rome, yet it was tolerated in the East. In fact, one patriarch of Constantinople, Photios, the Rai, kept a private library of such texts, and is said to have commissioned a genealogy that traced his own family back to those who stood in the light before the veil was drawn. What veil, he never says. But in Greek theology, the veil often represents the boundary between heaven and earth. To stand before it implies access, an origin beyond the curtain. We must also consider the frescoes. In the monastery of Hosios Loukas in central Greece, there is a curious depiction of Emperor Basil II, surrounded not by saints, but by 6 winged beings with human faces. The fresco lacks any explanatory text. Art historians call it an imperial vision. But why would an emperor be depicted among angels, not kneeling, but standing as one of them? Even stranger is the story of John VIII Palaiologos, one of the last emperors before the fall of Constantinople. A mystic by temperament, he wore a cloak embroidered with silver feathers and kept a personal physician who doubled as an astrologer. According to the notes of that physician preserved in the Bibliotheca Marciana of Venice, the emperor claimed he could hear celestial harmonies during the hours between midnight and dawn. Music from the Lineage, he reportedly said, that echoes from the stars. It would be laughable if not for the eerie frequency with which these emperors referenced stars, light, and blood in the same breath. Coincidence? Or the memory of something once believed, then quietly denied? Following the empire's collapse, many of these noble bloodlines fled westward. Some merged with Venetian or Florentine houses. Others vanished. But a handful, particularly those connected to the Lascaris and Komnenos dynasties, kept unusually meticulous family trees. Some of these trees contain odd annotations, stars beside certain names, eclipses beside others, and always a reference back to one ancestor simply labeled Iliaos, the Bright One. No dates, no spouse, just a name at the top, untouchable. A Vatican inquiry in 1762 into these lineages concluded with a single recommendation: do not pursue the lighted ones. Their blood is not for our books. The phrasing is cold, precise, and revealing. It suggests not just knowledge of the claim, but institutional weariness, an unwillingness to agitate something long dormant. So the question remains, did the Byzantine emperors believe they ruled by divine right or by divine blood? Were they weaving poetry into politics? Or were they guarding a thread older than empire itself? And if that thread still exists, wound now into new families in new lands, then perhaps the bloodline did not fall with Constantinople. Perhaps it adapted. They arrived in silence 9 nights without land or title, sworn to poverty, chastity, and war. They claimed only to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. And yet within a few short years, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ the Knights Templar had become one of the most powerful and mysterious forces in all of Christendom. From dusty roads to royal courts, from bloodied crusades to the inner sanctums of kings, they ascended faster than any order in medieval memory. And some say it wasn't treasure they found beneath Solomon's temple, but a truth about blood, a bloodline. And not just any bloodline, but one traced not to man, but to angels. The Templars were not fools. They were scholars as much as soldiers. They excavated under the Temple Mount for years long before Jerusalem's archaeological significance was broadly known. What were they digging for? Crusader chronicles say they sought relics, but private letters recovered centuries later, now housed in the French National Archives, hint at something stranger. A phrase repeated in multiple documents, sanguis celestis, heavenly blood. The Church never explained why the Templars, a militant order under papal command, were suddenly deemed heretics in 1307. The official charges were a mess, worshipping a bearded head, spitting on the cross, denying Christ. But beneath the absurdity lay something darker. Confessions extracted under torture mention secret rituals. One Templar, Raoul de Gizy, claimed during interrogation that the order guarded a scroll written in no earthly tongue, and that it spoke of a line of kings not born of Eve. This scroll, if it ever existed, vanished after the arrests. But a 17th-century Jesuit historian, Claude Duvernay, reported seeing a fragment of parchment during a Vatican tour that matched the description ink that shimmered under candlelight, a language resembling early Aramaic and a broken seal shaped like a winged star. Duvernay's report was confiscated. He was reassigned to the Congo and died there of fever within the year. So what were the Templars hiding? One persistent theory is that they uncovered genealogical records, perhaps even relics, proving a continuous bloodline stretching from the Watchers to key noble families in Europe. And more provocatively, that this bloodline intersected with Christ's own. Not in the speculative way modern conspiracy authors imagine, but in a way rooted in ancient belief systems. The belief that Jesus was not a singular anomaly, but a culmination of something older. A hybrid. The final flowering of angelic seed. This theory gains traction when we consider the Templars' obsession with Mary Magdalene. In many of their chapels, her image is prominent, even central, far more than ecclesiastical norms would allow. The Magdalene in Gnostic lore is not merely a witness. She is a carrier of wisdom, of memory, of flesh, and some believe of child. There's a Templar seal discovered in a remote chapel in Languedoc, southern France, that bears a fascinating image. 2 knights riding a single horse, a known Templar symbol, but flanked by a woman holding a vessel, and above her a descending star. Some interpret this as a reference to the Virgin Mary. Others say it's Magdalene holding not a relic, but a bloodline. And what of the Grail, traditionally seen as the cup used at the Last Supper, or to catch Christ's blood at the crucifixion? But etymologically, San Grail, Holy Grail, can be split into sang real royal blood. Was the Grail a metaphor? Or was it literal, a container of blood, not symbolic, but genetic? The Templars' sudden and violent dismantling suggests they stumbled onto something the Church could not allow to surface. When King Philip IV of France moved against them, it wasn't just for debt forgiveness, as some claim. His personal physician, Guillaume de Nogaret, was present at nearly every interrogation. Nogaret, historians have discovered, was a member of a secret philosophical society devoted to the preservation of ancient Hebrew mysticism. Why would such a man be placed so close to the destruction of a military order because the Templars weren't merely warriors? They were custodians. They had collected texts from the Levant, from Jewish scholars, from Islamic philosophers, from buried crypts beneath the old temple. Some of those texts may have described not events but genealogies, not parables but bloodlines. There are references scant and fragile to a relic once guarded at the commandery of Laon in northern France. A sealed vial of crystalline substance described as glowing softly in darkness. Witnesses claimed it was kept in a hollowed-out crucifix passed down through senior Templar ranks. The vial disappeared in 1307. Its last mention, a Latin phrase scribbled in the margin of an inventory list, corpus lucis, body of light. If this was blood or a symbolic representation of it, its preservation suggests a purpose beyond devotion. Perhaps it was proof. Perhaps it was prophecy. The idea that the bloodline still moved through the world, hidden, waiting. After the suppression of the Templars, many fled to Portugal, Scotland, and beyond. The Order of Christ, their successor in Portugal, continued under papal blessing and was instrumental in launching the Age of Exploration. Why some speculate they were still searching, not for gold, for heirs. In Rosslyn Chapel, Scotland, long linked to Templar legends, carvings depict plants found only in the Americas, carved decades before Columbus sailed. More strangely, among the ornate columns is a face human, yet oddly elongated, surrounded by 7 stars. Below it the inscription, Ex Sangue Stellarum, from the blood of the stars. It could be a metaphor, or it could be the final admission of a secret carried across oceans and centuries, that the Grail was never a cup but a child. That the treasure buried beneath Solomon's temple was not gold, but a document, a relic, a name. And if the Templars knew it, if they guarded it with their lives, then their annihilation makes perfect sense. You don't burn an order for heresy. You burn it to keep their truth from lighting the world. He was called the wonder of his age, a man of science, logic, and language in a world still tangled in superstition. Gerbert of Aurillac, who would become Pope Sylvester II, was a scholar long before he wore the papal tiara. Fluent in Arabic, steeped in mathematics and astronomy, he reintroduced Europe to the forgotten wonders of antiquity. But behind his brilliance trailed whispers of sorcery, of forbidden knowledge, and of a companion not quite human. They said he built a mechanical head that answered questions. They said he communed with stars. They said he traveled with an angel made of gears and light. The Church remembers Sylvester II as a transitional figure, the first French pope, a patron of learning. But his contemporaries viewed him with unease. He had studied in Muslim Spain, absorbing ancient Greek and Arabic texts unavailable to most Europeans. He brought back strange devices, armillary spheres, astrolabes, a monochord used for measuring the harmony of celestial spheres. Useful tools, yes, but too advanced, too perfect. Unsettling somehow. One legend repeated in several 12th century chronicles claims Sylvester constructed an oraculum, a bronze head, that could answer yes or no to any question. This brazen head appears again in later myths about Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, always associated with men who seem to know more than they should. The Church dismissed these tales as medieval folklore, but what if they weren't merely metaphors for intelligence? What if the legends grew from something real? A letter discovered in the 1800s attributed to a monk named Richard of Rheims describes visiting Sylvester in Rome and seeing a thing of metal that walked without breath, its eyes lit from within its limbs, guided not by flesh, but by spirit. Richard was not a fanciful man. His other writings are dry, detailed, precise. which makes this passage all the more strange and compelling. Another account, buried in the Chronicon Monasteri Cassinensis, states that Sylvester would disappear into a sealed chamber beneath the Lateran Palace every new moon. Only one attendant was ever permitted inside. That attendant, Brother Aeon, later vanished, his name struck from the monastic rolls. Rumors claim he went mad, whispering in tongues no one recognized, drawing star maps that matched no known constellations. Most intriguing, however, is a surviving schematic attributed to Sylvester, now stored under lock in the Vatican Technical Archives. Drawn on vellum, the image shows a humanoid figure composed of interlocking circles lines that correspond to lunar phases and annotations in a script resembling early Syriac. The Vatican's official position is that it's a meditation on the cosmic man, a symbolic representation of the microcosm. But privately, some researchers believe it is something else: instructions. Not for meditation, but for construction. So what does this have to do with a bloodline? Consider this: the mechanical angel may not have been a machine in the modern sense, but a vessel, a container for knowledge, possibly even for essence. In the writings of the Islamic mystic al-Kindi, there is mention of al-Jism al-Nurani, the luminous body and artificial form used by angelic intelligences to interact with humans without overwhelming them. Al-Kindi was one of the thinkers Gerbert studied while in Spain. Could Sylvester have attempted to recreate such a form? Could he have succeeded? If so, it's possible. He wasn't merely building for curiosity's sake. Perhaps he was decoding something or preserving it. A program, a protocol, maybe even a lineage of information too powerful to entrust to parchment alone. Think of it: a being built not just to speak, but to remember, to witness, to record the continuation of a bloodline begun in Eden and tracked through centuries. This aligns disturbingly well with a passage from a forbidden Templar codex reportedly discovered in Languedoc and later acquired by the Vatican. It refers to the keeper of the voice, a constructed man who shall speak when the light returns to the line. The phrase is maddeningly vague. But if the light is the divine bloodline, and the keeper a machine designed to watch over it, then Sylvester's creation was not a curiosity. It was a guardian. Pope Sylvester's death was as strange as his life. He reportedly died after taking communion at the Basilica of St. John Lateran, collapsing mid-Mass. But an obscure account, written by a minor canon named Nicholas de Pavia, claims that in the days before his death, Sylvester had become obsessed with a girl of unusual birth living near the Tiber. He visited her secretly. She disappeared the day he died. No record of her name remains. In his will, largely unremarkable, there is one phrase that has drawn attention for centuries. "Let my bones lie quiet unless the voice returns." What voice? The mechanical head, the lineage, or perhaps the blood itself encoded and passed, waiting to be recognized again? Some historians claim the legends of Sylvester's angel were later inventions meant to discredit his learning or associate him with forbidden magic. But then why would the Church centuries later quietly remove several of his scientific manuscripts from circulation? Why are there entire gaps in the papal records during his reign, entries scratched out, names left blank? And why do modern reports of sensitive blood anomalies, especially those involving young children with strange neural activity or genetic irregularities, still occasionally cross the desks of Jesuit advisors assigned to the Vatican's Congregation for Catholic Education? That's the department responsible for overseeing theological universities, and more recently, select biological ethics panels. The connections are thin, but they echo. A pope who built a man of metal. A bloodline that hums beneath history. A voice waiting to speak when the light returns. Maybe Sylvester wasn't heretical. Maybe he was early. The Renaissance gave us perspective literally. Depth shadow the illusion of distance on a flat canvas. But it also gave us something more subversive, the return of bodies. Sacred bodies, human bodies, divine bodies rendered in muscle and blood, not gilded halos and floating hands. And in the dim corners of this great rebirth, a quiet movement stirred. Artists, mystics, and scholars began to encode a heresy older than the Church itself, the idea that divinity was not apart from the human form, but embedded within it. That certain blood carried more than soul or virtue, that the flesh itself could shimmer with the memory of heaven. It began, as most heresies do, with a question no one wanted to ask. If God could take on human flesh once, why not more than once? Why not in other bodies, long before Bethlehem or long after? What if the incarnation was not a singular miracle, but the latest episode in a long genetic sequence? And what if artists newly freed from ecclesiastical rigidity began to leave behind clues, not just in brushstroke, but in bone? Take Botticelli. His mystic nativity is a fever dream of theology and longing. Beneath the swirling angels and golden crowns, there is a strange proportion to the figure's elongated heads, two large eyes, fingers curved like feathers. One scholar called it stylized idealism, but others suggest a different influence, depictions of beings who are not entirely human. Watch closely, and you'll notice that the Virgin in this scene is not passive. She looks directly at the viewer, and in her hands she holds not just a child, but a flame. Leonardo da Vinci, that obsessive chronicler of anatomy, famously dissected corpses in secret. But what few realize is that his notebooks, those densely packed pages of mirrored script, include a recurring phrase, il portatore della luce tra gli uomini, the bearer of light among men. It appears not once, but 14 times always, beside drawings of hands, veins, skulls. It is never explained. But one entry describes a child whose skull bears 7 sutures, unlike the norm. His blood coagulates not in air, but in warmth. No names, no location. Just that single unsettling observation. The page is smudged as if Leonardo himself hesitated or trembled. Meanwhile, Marsilio Ficino, the great Neoplatonist philosopher and translator of Hermetic texts, openly taught that the soul is drawn to its likeness in the stars, and that some souls, rare and radiant, do not descend like others, but fall burning through human bloodlines. He wrote of divina stirpes, the divine strain, and claimed that it could be passed through touch, through music, even through certain words spoken in the hour before dawn. He was never tried for heresy, but he died with a sealed letter to the Pope reportedly burned unread. This was the Renaissance's dangerous dance, the resurrection of old knowledge dressed in new robes. Behind the symmetry and chiaroscuro painters embedded sacred geometries and coded references to ancient myths that spoke not of gods, but of those who fell from heaven bearing knowledge and perhaps seed. Consider Michelangelo's creation of Adam, the famous outstretched hands, the space between them. But step back and the shape surrounding God is unmistakable, a human brain. Was it a statement about reason, or was it more literal, a depiction of consciousness being passed not by divine fiat, but by design, a gift implanted, a spark carried forward? And then there's the issue of portraits. In multiple works from the period we find subjects with anomalies, golden irises, additional phalanges, fingers too long to belong to any standard anatomy. In Raphael's Madonna of the Goldfinch, the infant Christ has a shadow under his skin, a faint outline near his shoulder, like wings folded inward. No art historian mentions it, but once seen, it cannot be unseen. Church authorities, sensing the growing fire, responded with quiet suppression. Artists were rarely excommunicated, too popular, too profitable. But their works were reinterpreted, their writings edited or lost. Inquisitors shifted focus from witches to whispers, tracking groups of thinkers who believed not in demons but in descent. One such group, La Confraternita del Lume Perduto, was erased entirely from public record. But their symbol remains a stylized feather piercing a spiral etched into the wood of a chapel bench in San Gimignano. Local guides call it a mason's mark, but it appears in no stonemason guilds, only here. And in one other place, a margin of Ficino's De Vita Colitis Comparanda on drawing down life from the heavens. Perhaps the most damning clue comes from an anonymous 16th-century manuscript uncovered in the library of the Escorial in Spain. Titled In Carne Lux in Flesh Light, it details a lineage traced from Alexandria to Venice to Bruges, describing children born with memories not their own dreams of winged cities and visions of burning towers made of glass. The manuscript ends abruptly with a note. The line bends west. They are not many, but they remember. The Vatican never commented on the manuscript. But 2 years after its discovery, the archivist who catalogued it resigned and entered a monastery in silence. Today we call these things metaphors. We visit museums, we admire the genius of artists who captured the divine. But what if they weren't capturing it? What if they were documenting it? And what if some of them knew the Renaissance was not just a rebirth of art? It was the re-emergence of a question the Church had hoped was buried. What if the divine is not only above but within, not in all people but in some? Not through faith alone, but through inheritance. What if the blood remembers? Long before the Capets, before Charlemagne, before the Carolingian rise, there was another dynasty, older, stranger, haloed by myth and veiled in blood. The Merovingians, rulers of the Franks from the 5th to the 8th century, they were a curious mix of historical kings and shimmering legend. Their symbols included bees, long hair, and serpents. They claimed descent not just from Troy, but from something older still. Something or someone who came from beyond. And if you listen closely to the chants beneath centuries of silence, you might hear the word whispered in monastic dark angel. The Merovingians were said to be sacral kings born with a divine aura. Gregory of Tours, the 6th century bishop and chronicler, notes that when King Clovis was baptized, a light filled the chamber, though no candle was lit. Other sources, less canonical, speak of blood that resisted decay, bodies that did not rot, kings who bled not red but clear. Of course, these accounts were always dismissed as pious exaggeration. But buried among these miracles is something more disturbing: the notion that the Merovingian line was different. Their founder, Merovesh, is shrouded in mystery. His very name suggests duality, mer, meaning sea. According to one legend, Merovech was born after his mother encountered a beast of the sea, a creature described as half man, half something else. Some interpretations say it was a sea god. Others say it was a mythological chimera. But a few, notably in suppressed Templar writings, claim it was a being of light and angelic presence that descended not from heaven, but from the waters above, an allusion to Genesis and the firmament. The Church has long ignored this legend, understandably. A dynasty founded on union with something non-human is not easy to canonize. But early Christian sects in Gaul, particularly among the Cathars, preserved parts of the story. To them, the Merovingians were not just kings, they were vessels. The Cathars believed in a dualistic universe, one of light, one of corruption. The body was flawed, but within it lived sparks of divine origin, and some bodies, they taught, carried more of this spark than others. The Merovingians, they claimed, carried the light unbroken, This belief may explain why the Cathars were exterminated with such fury. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in the 13th century, wasn't just a war against heresy, it was a cleansing. The Vatican sent armies into the Languedoc not just to silence doctrine, but to erase bloodlines. Entire families were slaughtered, cities burned. At Béziers, when asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful, the papal legate famously said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." History recorded it as brutality. But perhaps it was policy, because there are persistent rumors, especially among 19th-century esoteric societies, that certain Cathar families were of Merovingian descent, that the Church feared not their ideas, but their DNA. The connection to divine blood resurfaced in the writings of the Priory of Sion, a semi-mythical secret society first brought to public attention in the 1960s. Though many of the Priory's claims were later debunked or discredited, one assertion remains oddly resilient, that the Merovingian bloodline continued through carefully arranged marriages, hidden identities, and aliases, that it survives to this day. But the real story doesn't lie in secret societies or coded parchments. It lies in the curious relationship between the Merovingians and the Church. Initially allies, the kings were crowned by bishops wrapped in oil adorned with relics. But after a few generations, they were systematically undermined. By the time of the Carolingians, the Merovingians had been reduced to puppets, do-nothing kings, history calls them. Then quietly, they vanished. Or so we're told. The Vatican's archives contain curious gaps in Merovingian documentation. Papal correspondence with Clovis is preserved. But letters from later popes to Merovingian successors, particularly Dagobert II, are sparse, often missing. Dagobert in particular is a mystery. Exiled as a child, restored as king, then assassinated under suspicious circumstances. His death marked the end of real Merovingian power. Yet in some obscure French abbey records, there are mentions of a child of light who escaped Dagobert's fate. Raised in secrecy, protected by monks. The child's name is never given. But the implication is clear: the blood did not end with Dagobert. It simply went dark. Over the centuries, references to this line pop up like spectral fingerprints. A 15th-century Benedictine scribe refers to the house that bleeds in silence. A 17th-century Italian Jesuit warns in a private letter of the re-emergence of the star line. And a modern entry shockingly recent appears in a Vatican internal memo from 1987. Verify the Rhine families for divergence. Track female line descent for markers. No explanation is given, but the language suggests genetics, not doctrine, surveillance, not theology. So what does this have to do with angels? Everything, if the Merovingians were indeed descended, or believed to be descended, from a union between human and divine. Their symbols reflect this: bees associated with resurrection and harmony. The fleur-de-lis, later co-opted by French royalty, but once a symbol of trinity and purity. In one rare Merovingian sigil, the wings of an angel are bound to a sword, the hilt wrapped in ivy. It's an image of duality: light and blood, weapon and vine. Heaven rooted in earth. Modern blood analysis of supposed Merovingian remains is inconclusive. But in 2003, a French anthropologist studying skeletal material from a Merovingian-era crypt noted unusual cranial features, including elongated skulls and minor bone density anomalies inconsistent with known local populations. The study was never published in a major journal. Funding evaporated. The samples were returned to the Church. So we're left with traces, not proof, but possibility. A dynasty that rose fast and fell faster. A people who claimed no ordinary lineage. A church that, once their usefulness faded, erased their memory with surgical precision. and yet the blood may still sing, not in palaces but in shadows, not in history books but in veins. By the time the Merovingian line had faded into whispers and ruins, the Vatican faced a new challenge, not from thrones or armies, but from knowledge. Printing presses had birthed a flood of forbidden texts. The old heresies were no longer muttered in cloisters, but printed in pamphlets, carried across borders in saddlebags and scholars' trunks. And so the Church, ever adaptive, unleashed a countermeasure, not a sword, not an edict, but a mind. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, an order founded on disciplined brilliance and an unshakable mandate: protect the truth, or bury it. Founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuits were more than priests. They were linguists, mathematicians, astronomers, diplomats. They embedded themselves in the royal courts of Europe, advised emperors, mapped the heavens, and ran schools on every continent. But behind the polished rhetoric and scholastic rigor was something colder, sharper, a protocol handed down quietly from superior to initiate. When heresy evolves, infiltration must precede annihilation. It didn't take long for the Jesuits to encounter the bloodline question. In 1561, a report from a Jesuit mission in southern France detailed a group of vision-bearers in the Pyrenees who spoke of a lineage untouched by original sin. The report was not sent to Rome, but to a shadow office within the Collegio Romano, a hidden cell later referenced as Domus Caelestis. Their task: investigate bloodline anomalies, trace family lines, classify biological irregularities. No one outside the order ever saw their findings, but signs of their work surface if you know where to look. One codex attributed to the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher contains an encrypted section describing those born under harmonic resonance, said to possess uncanny memory, luminous skin in early childhood, and an aversion to iron. The section was removed in later editions. Kircher's biographers attributed it to alchemical speculation. Yet an original, unaltered copy, now in the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Roma, reveals a phrase that stands out: sanguis mixtus celestis et humanus, blood mixed of heaven and man. There were also field operations. In 1604, a Jesuit priest named Manuel Acosta was dispatched to the Valtellina Valley in northern Italy to investigate a boy rumored to speak fluent Hebrew and Aramaic, despite having never been taught. The boy also claimed to see music. Acosta's journal describes the child drawing star maps no adult could interpret, including constellations only visible from the southern hemisphere. After 2 weeks, the boy vanished. Acosta's entry ends abruptly. He is not to be studied further. Order from above. Above what Rome, or something older, there's a curious overlap between Jesuit activity and families rumored to carry divine bloodlines. The Jesuits opened schools in regions associated with Merovingian and Byzantine descent. They cultivated relationships with old noble houses, not the powerful ones, but the peculiar ones. The ones with long memories, sealed archives, and portraits of ancestors who all shared the same unnerving eyes. In South America, Jesuit missionaries cataloged indigenous legends with startling familiarity to the Watcher myth. Tribes in Peru spoke of sky fathers who took women and left behind children with fire in their veins. The Jesuits translated these myths, but never published them. One report, now held in a private Jesuit library in Salamanca, refers to a girl born in the Andes with an inexplicable mutation, a double heartbeat, perfectly synchronized, undetectable, to touch audible only through bone conduction. The report's margin note reads, Lux viva, living light. Back in Europe, the rise of the Enlightenment changed tactics. Overt suppression became dangerous. So the Jesuits turned to obfuscation. They didn't destroy heresies, they diluted them. flooded the world with symbols, half-truths, romantic novels, fiction disguised as speculation. A Jesuit named Louis de Montfort is believed to have inserted coded phrases into children's catechisms instructions for future initiates. One line from 1711 reads, "The blood of kings is no more precious than the breath of angels unless they meet again." It was around this time that the Jesuits began keeping what came to be known as the Sanguine Index, an internal registry of families marked for observation. No arrests, no trials, just monitoring. Watching for signs, unusual intelligence, rare blood types, spontaneous linguistic ability, resistance to disease, prophetic dreams. The families were often unaware, sometimes nudged toward cloisters, sometimes married into other lines. Always guided. One of the most disturbing entries in the index refers to a woman in Prague, born in 1793, who reportedly exhibited chromatic blood shifting in hue under certain light. Her confessor, a Jesuit named Père Thomas, recorded his observations in cipher. The final entry reads, "She sings when no sound is made. The breath in her is not from Adam. No records of her remain." When the Jesuits were suppressed by Pope Clement XIII in 1773, many believed their secrets would die with them. But the society re-emerged in 1814 more cautious, more selective. Their focus had shifted. Less politics, more science. Several Jesuits became leaders in early genetics, paleography, anthropology, always with one eye on the bloodline question. Even today, their presence lingers. In 2006, a Jesuit scientist working with the Vatican Observatory published a paper on the theoretical implications of non-terrestrial biological origins. The paper was retracted within weeks. The author, Father Lucien Moretti, was reassigned to a remote post in Madagascar. His data magnetic resonance scans of certain European relics was never released. But those relics matter. Jesuit archives contain notes on DNA traces from bone fragments believed to belong to saints or others. Many were deemed non-viable for comparison. But one note remains unredacted. Subject 341C shows deviation consistent with pre-Adamic profile. There is no definition of what that means. The Jesuits are not villains in black robes. They are something stranger. Sentries, gardeners, genealogists of the unseen. Not trying to erase the bloodline, but to manage it. Canonization is supposed to be a celebration of holiness of lives lived in service to divine will. But in the shadows of sainthood lies something stranger, a curation of memory. An editorial process cloaked in incense and Latin, quietly transforming real people into acceptable symbols. And sometimes when a life doesn't fit the mold, when a body carries something too radiant, too foreign, too inherited, that saint is not celebrated. That saint is erased. Over the centuries, dozens of would-be saints have vanished from the Church's official narrative. Some were decanonized for political reasons, others lost due to wars or schisms. But a select few, a very select few, disappeared under far more mysterious circumstances. Their hagiographies were altered, their relics reclassified, their feast days forgotten. And in several of these cases, one pattern emerges: references to physical traits, visions, or divine origins that could suggest a bloodline not wholly human. Take Saint Amalasuintha of Ravenna, not formally canonized, but widely venerated in the 8th century. A princess turned nun, her relics were said to emit a faint glow. Her contemporaries described her as one whose dreams set fires. Her name appeared in the Martyrologium Hieronymianum, one of the Church's earliest calendars of saints, until the 10th century. And then, gone. No mention, no retraction, just silence. Her shrine was dismantled, her bones relocated. Today she is remembered only in fragments, a single window pane in a rural chapel, her image scratched out, but for a pair of wings carved behind her. Or consider Saint Julian of Cuenca, a bishop with an unusual hagiography. In 13th century manuscripts, he is described as having eyes like molten gold and a voice that compelled the sick to rise. Multiple pilgrims reported healings merely by hearing his prayers, not touching him, not receiving sacraments, just hearing his voice. His canonization was approved, then abruptly rescinded. The Vatican attributed this to confusion with another Julian, but documents from the time show no such confusion. Only a marginal note in an internal church record veris said inacceptabilis, true, but unacceptable. These figures are not isolated. They appear like glitches in the sacred tapestry flashes of something that was meant to be seen only briefly. In a suppressed 17th century Jesuit compilation titled De Sanctis Non Probatis, 43 individuals are listed under the heading Candidati Revocati, revoked candidates. Most of their entries include notes like insufficient miracle documentation or unreliable witnesses. But several have cryptic annotations, sanguinis, ignoti, blood of unknown origin, testes residunt lucem, witnesses, withdraw from the light, and most disturbingly, non convenit cum Adam, not consistent with Adam. It is worth noting that these annotations appear alongside efforts to scrub related relics from public veneration. In 1812, for instance, the bones of Saint Leora of Antioch, a 2nd century martyr once revered for her light that moved without sun, were removed from display. Pilgrims had reported dreams in her presence, some claiming to speak languages they'd never learned. The bones were transferred to a private ossuary and labeled non-identificata. Requests to study the remains have been denied without explanation. Why would the Church go to such lengths, not to suppress holiness, but to shape it? Saints are meant to reflect doctrine, not distort it. And those who do not conform, whose lives suggest lineage rather than miracle, inheritance rather than grace, are quietly folded out of history, made invisible. Even hagiographies that remain in circulation show signs of heavy revision. The Acta Sanctorum, that exhaustive catalogue of saintly lives compiled by the Bollandists, contains dozens of entries where early manuscripts differ significantly from modern versions. In particular, the descriptions of birth are often altered. Born beneath a burning star becomes born during a difficult winter. The voice of angels heard at birth becomes choral singing from a nearby monastery. And in a few rare cases, original texts refer to the return of the light blood language so specific, so charged, it almost demands to be struck out. One example that barely survived this purge is Saint Marcellina of Syracuse. Her 14th century Vita describes how, as a child, she refused to sleep on the ground because she could feel the stones whispering. At age 10, she drew a map of the night sky showing constellations no one recognized, until NASA astronomers in the 1980s identified the pattern as matching a system visible only from deep southern latitudes. Marcellina was canonized locally. Her cult limited her feast day, never formalized. Her relics declared unverifiable. Yet she remains beloved in certain Sicilian enclaves, where her name is invoked not in Latin prayers, but in starlight rituals. This all feeds a growing scholarly suspicion that the Church has quietly identified and contained individuals believed to carry the spark, a divine trait, an anomaly in the flesh. Not demons, not saints in the traditional sense, but something in between. Bearers of a sacred inheritance that predates the Gospels. And the role of sainthood in these cases becomes clear not to elevate them, but to entomb them. To put the bloodline in a reliquary and lock it away. Modern examples are harder to track, but they exist. In 1954, a nun in Bavaria was nominated for sainthood after reportedly surviving a fire that consumed her convent. Her body showed no burns, The postulant process moved swiftly until a Vatican investigator discovered that she had a rare blood phenotype found in only 6 people worldwide. The cause was closed. Her name was removed from consideration. No official reason was given. Another case, unverified but persistent in underground Catholic circles, involves a child in the Philippines whose touch allegedly healed the blind. A delegation from the Congregation for the Causes of Saints visited her village. Within weeks, the family had relocated. The church issued a statement. There is no investigation at this time. So what does all this mean? That saints are not always who we think they are? That some perhaps were never meant to be saints, only observed, managed, contained. Their stories rewritten not to preserve doctrine, but to protect the silence. And in that silence, the bloodline waits. There is something unsettling about silence in an age obsessed with measurement. We live in a world of genetic code of microscopes that see into the very spiral of life. And yet, when it comes to the most sacred relics on earth, fragments of the crossbones of saints, shrouds of divine touch, the loudest noise from the Vatican is quiet refusal, not denial, just stillness. A studied hush that grows more curious the closer science creeps toward answers. In the 1980s, a group of researchers made headlines after testing what is perhaps the most famous relic of all, the Shroud of Turin. The results, carbon dated to the Middle Ages, were splashed across newspapers as a definitive debunking. But buried in the footnotes of those studies and later papers were inconsistencies, variations in sampling areas, contamination concerns, and more intriguing still, indications that the fibers may have contained biological traces not easily categorized within known human haplogroups. In one instance, a mitochondrial anomaly was flagged as non-localized. The report used the phrase genetic signature of undetermined origin. Then the samples were sealed, access revoked, case closed. And yet within the walls of the Vatican museums, there are over 2,000 catalogued relics. Bones, cloth, vials of blood, alleged tears, thorns, nails. Only a tiny fraction have ever been subjected to modern analysis. When requests are made, especially by secular labs or universities, the answer is almost always the same. Out of respect for the sacred nature of the item, no invasive testing will be permitted. This wouldn't be remarkable if not for the exceptions. In 1998, under immense pressure from both scientists and pilgrims, the Vatican allowed limited DNA analysis on relics believed to be from St. Luke. The results were strange. The bones did belong to a man from the Eastern Mediterranean. Yes, but certain markers, particularly those involving HLA alleles, the very genes that help the immune system recognize self from other, did not match any known modern population. One Jesuit biologist, speaking off-record, described the DNA as ancient but foreign. Another simply said, he wasn't from here. Then there's the matter of the angel's blood. That's not its official name, of course. But it's how certain insiders refer to a sealed reliquary in a side chapel of the Basilica di San Giovanni in Laterano. The contents are undocumented in official registries. A single 18th-century document refers to it as sanguinem de caelo che si dice, blood fallen from heaven. A Vatican archivist claimed anonymously that in the early 2000s, samples were secretly taken and analyzed. The findings inconclusive. But the analyst reportedly resigned weeks later, citing psychological stress and the collapse of prior metaphysical assumptions. Now that could mean anything, or nothing. But one cannot help noticing that whenever genetic technology approaches a certain boundary, when it brushes against the sacred, something pulls back. Doors close, archives vanish, funding dries up. There's a chilling consistency to it. Consider the case of the Sudarium of Oviedo, a blood-stained cloth believed by some to have covered the head of Jesus. Tests done in the 1990s confirmed the blood type as AB rare, but not unknown. What raised eyebrows was that it matched the blood type found on the Shroud of Turin. Even more curious, both samples lacked certain D antigen markers found in 85% of humans. A Vatican spokesman dismissed it as coincidence. Others called it divine. But among geneticists, whispers began to spread about a third branch. A human, but not fully of Eve. A lineage that might trace back to something or someone else. These whispers grew louder in the age of the Human Genome Project. And not just in secular science. Several Catholic universities quietly convened ethics committees in the early 2000s to discuss non-natural inheritance in relic-based DNA. One internal memo leaked and later discredited described theoretical scenarios in which DNA from a divine intermediary might disrupt human baselines. The memo ended with a question: if the blood of heaven once touched earth, what remains of it in us? Even Pope John Paul II, known for his deep intellect and mystical leanings, made cryptic references in his later writings. In one homily, he spoke of flesh that bore the light of God not merely in spirit, but in cell and marrow. In another, he warned against the arrogance of dissection without reverence. It could be interpreted metaphorically, or not. If the Church has ever discovered definitive genetic proof of an angelic bloodline, a chromosomal anomaly, a mitochondrial echo of divine touch, it has never admitted it. And yet its behavior speaks volumes. The sudden closures of relics to testing, the abrupt reshuffling of staff after certain investigations, the unexplained retirements of scientists who got too close. And perhaps most compelling, the quiet acquisition of relics by the Vatican itself. In 2011, a private collection of purported apostolic relics in Belgium was purchased by a Vatican-backed foundation and immediately removed from public view. No explanation was given. No further studies permitted. This raises uncomfortable questions. Is the Church protecting the sacred from desecration, or hiding evidence of something it cannot control? It would not be the first time spiritual institutions have bent science to the service of mystery. But here the stakes are unique. Because this isn't about miracles. It's about flesh, blood, inheritance. The one thing no doctrine can rewrite. And so we arrive at an impasse. Science reaches out, asks its quiet questions. But the answers, if they exist, lie locked behind layers of wholly silent stone walls and velvet gloves. Still, even silence can leave a trace. And perhaps the greatest clue is not in what the Church has said, but in what it refuses to let us see. She has appeared on hillsides and in caves, in backwater towns and war-torn cities, to children, shepherds, skeptics, and saints. Always clothed in light, always serene, always just out of reach of the cynical mind. The Virgin Mary, in her apparitions, has become the most witnessed, most documented supernatural phenomenon in human history. And yet, through all the visions and proclamations, a strange pattern emerges, not in what she says, but in what she doesn't say. Not in the miracles themselves, but in the persistent undercurrent of blood. It begins with Lourdes in 1858. A poor 14-year-old girl named Bernadette Suberus, sickly and illiterate, begins seeing a lady in white. She speaks of penance and prayer, of building a chapel. But what's often omitted from the sanitized retellings is the emphasis on the Immaculate Conception, not just as dogma, but as identity. Bernadette claimed the lady called herself the Immaculate Conception, not just someone who experienced it. The phrasing is odd, like calling oneself the Resurrection or the Holy Trinity. Some theologians dismissed it as poetic confusion, But others wondered if it was something more a genetic declaration, not a title of purity but of origin. Then came Fatima, 1917. 3 children in rural Portugal report a luminous woman brighter than the sun. Over 6 months, she gives them secrets, terrifying visions of hell, prophecies of war, and warnings about Russia. But buried beneath the spectacle is a peculiar detail. She shows them a heart encircled with thorns, bleeding but unconsumed. Scholars interpret this as the Immaculate Heart, symbolizing compassion. But in Gnostic texts, a bleeding heart wrapped in thorns is also the mark of a divine bloodline, preserved through suffering, protected by secrecy. At Medjugorje in Bosnia, the visions began in 1981 and have never officially stopped. The messages are cryptic, often repetitive. But in 1982, one of the seers asked the apparition a question not about prayer or penance, but about genealogy. "Are you the same as the woman in the Book of Revelation?" The apparition answered, "I am." A chilling reference to the woman clothed with the sun, crowned with stars, crying out in birth pangs. That woman, in some interpretations, is not Mary at all, but a symbol of the divine feminine, a bearer of blood and seed. These events have never sat comfortably with the Vatican. Official recognition has been slow, cautious, and often accompanied by qualifiers. Even in approved cases like Lourdes and Fatima, the Church insists belief in the apparitions is not mandatory. This hedging raises a question: is the discomfort purely doctrinal, or is it genetic? In every major Marian apparition, there's an emphasis on lineage, on descent, on something passed from mother to child that carries both spiritual and physical weight. At Garabandal in the 1960s, the apparition reportedly told the visionaries that there would be a great warning, a great miracle, and a great sign, all tied to humanity's ability to recognize the truth. When asked what that truth was, she said only, "You will know it in your blood." Perhaps this is all metaphor, but metaphors don't hide DNA samples. In 2004, a Vatican-sponsored medical team traveled to a small church in Mexico, where a statue of Mary was reportedly weeping blood. Tests were inconclusive. The blood was real. Type AB again. But when scientists pressed for genetic analysis, the samples were destroyed in a storage accident. A coincidence. Just like the carbon samples from the Sudarium. Just like the sealed archives from the Belgian relics. And then there's the matter of the so-called Black Madonnas, statues, and icons of Mary, with dark skin found all over Europe. For centuries, scholars argued over whether the darkness was symbolic artistic or the result of candle soot. But a few researchers proposed something heretical, that the Black Madonna imagery preserved an older memory, one of a woman descended from a different line. A bloodline neither European nor Semitic. Something other. One 13th century hymn describes her as Negra sed formosa, black but beautiful, and attributes to her the wisdom of the angels. The phrasing echoes the Song of Songs, but also certain Coptic and Ethiopian traditions that link Mary not just to David, but to Enoch. When Mary appears, she does not speak of institutions. She doesn't cite canon law. She rarely praises popes. Instead, she speaks of suffering of children of things lost and things returning. In the visions, she bleeds, glows, and mourns, not like a doctrine, but like a mother whose lineage has been silenced. The Vatican, of course, walks a careful line. It permits devotions, builds shrines, canonizes seers, but it never embraces the full implications. Because if Mary is more than mother, if she is the vessel of a bloodline not fully human, then the Church's structure begins to creak. After Fatima, the third secret was locked in a safe for decades. When it was finally revealed, it described a bishop in white dying among ruins. But many scholars believe the real secret was withheld. A fourth secret. one that perhaps described not death but birth, not a warning about sin but a clue about blood. Imagine if all these apparitions are not simply divine pep talks, but encoded messages, warnings and invitations, whispered confirmations that something ancient lives still in the veins of a few, that the line was not broken but scattered, hidden in convents, orphanages, and unknowing hosts. And so Mary returns again and again, not to reinforce doctrine but to remind, to stir something dormant in the body of the faithful, a recognition, a calling, a memory of flesh that once bore the light of heaven. She does not speak loudly, but she is never ignored. And perhaps that is the Church's greatest challenge, not denying her, but daring to interpret her. In the flickering lamplight of monasteries and the dark corners of medieval pulpits, a peculiar fear took root, one that twisted angelic myths into nightmares. It wasn't enough to dismiss ancient claims of divine bloodlines as heresy. To control the narrative fully, the Church needed to do something far more effective: weaponize it. And so the angel seed, a once sacred notion of celestial heritage, was transformed into the vilest of terrors. Demonology became the tool. Theology bent into horror. And those who may have carried the blood of angels were recast as monsters. The transformation wasn't immediate. It began with subtle shifts in language. In early Christian centuries, apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch spoke openly of the Watchers' angels who descended, took wives, and begot the Nephilim. But by the 12th century, those same Watchers were no longer framed as tragic rebels or misguided lovers. They were reclassified as devils. The offspring of divine human unions were no longer seen as giants with potential, but as abominations, corrupted flesh, inherently dangerous. Medieval demonologists such as Johann Weyer and Heinrich Kramer began cataloging what they called succubi and incubi spirits that seduced humans in their sleep, collecting their essence, tainting their bloodlines. The sexualization of demons was no accident. It was a calculated move to sever the idea that angels could incarnate or interact biologically with humans. If people believed any such unions produced evil, then even whispers of angelic descent would inspire fear, not reverence. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 and used widely by inquisitors, declared that demons could manipulate human seed to produce monstrous children. These children, often born under mysterious circumstances, were said to carry uncanny beauty knowledge beyond their years or strange powers. The text did not frame them as blessed, but cursed. And here's where the irony sets in. Many of the traits listed: radiant eyes, innate wisdom, prophetic dreams, mirror earlier descriptions of angel-blooded individuals in Gnostic and Eastern Christian texts. But what was once revered became grounds for execution. A curious case arose in France during the early 1300s, during the same decades that the Knights Templar were being purged. In a small village near Limoges, a child was born with striking features, platinum hair, startling gray eyes, and a mark over the heart shaped like a star. Midwives said the child never cried, even when cold. Word spread that he was the product of a union between a nun and an unseen visitor who glowed. The Church's response was swift. The mother was executed. The child disappeared. Official records list the incident as a case of demonic seduction and unnatural birth, but the symbolism of the star-shaped mark is familiar. It matches descriptions in pre-Christian art of angelic emissaries bearing the sign of Venus, often misinterpreted later as a cult. One might recall the earlier mention of Black Madonnas. Some of these icons were rumored to weep not tears, but blood. In Prague, A statue was locked away for decades after reports that its eyes glowed at night and caused fever dreams among nuns. The symptoms were attributed to demonic influence. But a suppressed document from a Jesuit archivist described the dreams as visions of winged ancestors bathed in gold. Again, what the Church branded as illness may have been legacy. To maintain control, the Church needed more than just theological rebuke. They needed spectacle. And so the Inquisition doubled down. Witch trials, possession rituals, and exorcisms surged. In the transcripts, certain patterns appear. Many accused witches were described as having dreams of flying beings, radiant men, who whispered forgotten names. They spoke of light entering their wombs, of children lost too soon or born with eyes that saw too much. These were not delusions of madness, they were fragments, echoes, genetic memories misread through the lens of religious paranoia. A whisper from earlier chapters returns now the role of Jesuits as enforcers. In a letter dated 1653 found in a Lisbon archive, a Jesuit named Matteo de Lucena described an exorcism in Sardinia. The young girl afflicted reportedly spoke in a language no priest recognized. She called herself Azrael's child and warned of a time when the seeds of light will awaken. De Lucena's recommendation, the girl be imprisoned indefinitely and all witnesses silenced. Not because she was a threat, but because she might have been telling the truth. Even the architecture of demonology reflects this fear of blood. Take the medieval concept of the cambion, a half-demon child often identified by unusual calmness, otherworldly beauty, or preternatural intelligence. These descriptors match tales of divine offspring in other traditions, from India's devas to the Greek demigods. But once again, the Church painted all non-standard births with the same brush. It didn't matter if the child quoted scripture or lit candles by thought. If they weren't fully human by Church standards, they were dangerous. And yet not all were convinced. A Benedictine monk named Isidorus, writing in the 1400s, penned a private commentary hidden in the margins of his psalter. He questioned why every text linking angels to humanity was burned or buried. He speculated that perhaps the fear was not of evil, but of power, of a lineage that bypassed papal control. His scribbled note ends simply, "If angels have walked among us, then perhaps some never left." So the narrative was sealed. The seed of the angels once revered, then buried, became the stuff of horror stories. And in doing so, the Church rewrote genetics as possession, heritage as curse. They didn't just silence a bloodline, they demonized it. But even in the darkest libraries of demonology, a strange light flickers. Anomalies, footnotes, names that reappear across continents and centuries. The same traits, the same dreams, the same fear. Which begs the question if the demonologists got it wrong. What exactly were they trying so hard to hide? There is a moment in every long-kept secret where silence begins to crack under the weight of time. In the case of the angelic bloodline, that moment hovers at the edge of Scripture itself, in the book meant to close the canon, to declare history complete. Revelation, with its surreal visions, dragons, angels, and plagues, has long baffled theologians. But beneath the imagery lies a more curious puzzle: what might have been removed. For centuries, whispers echoed through monasteries and theological circles that Revelation once held more than what now remains. Pages lost, redacted, or simply never included in the official canon. Some were said to describe not only the end of the world, but the return of something the Church dared not name, a bloodline luminous and strange, arising not from kings or prophets, but from beings not entirely of this earth. The earliest known controversy over Revelation's content emerged in the 4th century. When the canon of the New Testament was being debated, Revelation was hotly contested. Some bishops believed it too dangerous, too cryptic. Others feared its imagery might lend itself to heretical interpretations. One of the fiercest critics was a bishop named Gaius of Rome, who suggested that parts of Revelation were forgeries inserted by those who follow the seed of angels. A curious phrase, and not one you'll find in modern translations. One manuscript, Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, offers tantalizing clues. Though largely overwritten, scholars have used ultraviolet light to recover fragments beneath the later text. Among them is a passage resembling Revelation, but absent from modern editions. It reads, "And the voice said, 'They are marked not with number but with light. They bear the seal of him who crossed stars to touch the earth.' No beast, no plagues. Just a cryptic reference to a lineage bearing celestial marks." Another clue comes from the writings of Saint Victorinus, one of the earliest commentators on Revelation. In his original commentary, later censored and republished, he described a chapter in which the sons of Michael walk among the ruins untouched by flame. But this chapter is nowhere to be found. Modern editions erase any mention of these passages, and Victorinus himself was posthumously edited by later theologians seeking to preserve orthodoxy. The most persistent rumors concern a section that once followed Revelation 12, the chapter involving the woman clothed with the sun pursued by the dragon. In this mythic vision, the woman gives birth to a male child destined to rule. But some ancient versions, now lost, reportedly contained a continuation, a description of the child's descendants, of those born from fire and silence whose blood does not spoil. The implications, if real, would be seismic. It's here we must revisit the strange case of the Montanists, a 2nd century Christian sect, who claimed to receive ongoing revelations directly from the Holy Spirit. They were among the first to assert that Revelation had been tampered with. Their prophets spoke of scrolls hidden beneath the golden floor of Rome containing truths that would undo the priesthood. They believed that the return of Christ would coincide with the awakening of a lineage hidden since Eden, a lineage that could not die. Unsurprisingly, the Montanists were declared heretics. Their texts vanished, their leaders executed or absorbed into silence, and yet the idea persisted. In 1253, a Dominican inquisitor in Lyon recorded the testimony of a dying mystic. She claimed that during a dream she was shown a book that bleeds when opened and told to read the part after the last trumpet. She recited words that do not appear in any known Bible. They are not born as men are born, nor do they pass as men pass. They remain until the veil is lifted. The inquisitor dismissed her as delirious. But he preserved the quote, perhaps because it lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Modern scholars dismiss these stories as apocryphal, of course. The canon is the canon, they insist. The Bible is closed. But this same confidence existed before the Dead Sea Scrolls emerged from the caves of Qumran, proving that entire books, entire voices had been excluded for centuries. The possibility that something so central, so radical, could have been buried is no longer unthinkable. Even now, the Vatican remains unusually guarded about its oldest Revelation manuscripts. The Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana houses several pre-Vulgate codices, but researchers report restrictions on access, particularly to folios dealing with the later chapters. One former archivist, under condition of anonymity, spoke of a text known as Revelatio Prima, a proto-version of the Apocalypse attributed to John but never approved. It contained what he described as genealogies, not of man, but of stars. If these documents truly exist, they remain hidden not because they contradict faith, but because they expand it beyond controllable bounds. A lineage tied to angels, a promise of return, a pattern embedded in human history, just faint enough to deny, yet persistent enough to haunt. And so the missing pages remain missing. Not burned, perhaps, not lost, but locked away, waiting. Because if they were ever to surface, if the world were ever to read that final verse, then the question becomes, what happens next? Do cathedrals fall? Or does something else rise in their place? There is a whisper older than the church and quieter than prayer that not all bloodlines fade into myth. Some simply step into the shadows, and some even now still breathe among us. It begins not with a grand revelation, but with a strange pattern families across Europe and the Near East, whose genealogies vanish into obscurity at crucial moments, yet reappear with wealth influence or immunity. Not nobility in the traditional sense, not power earned or granted, but a kind of quiet untouchability. These are not royal lines, but peculiar ones spoken of in hushed tones by monks, by Templars, and on rare occasions by Vatican archivists who speak more freely after their fourth glass of wine. In the 18th century, a Jesuit priest named Father Pietro Lombardi was expelled from the order for reasons never publicly disclosed. In his private journals later recovered from a locked chest in Sicily, he chronicled what he called the carriers. According to his notes, the Vatican maintained a secret registry not of heretics, but of individuals bearing a unique blood trait. He described their presence as neither holy nor profane, but immune to time. The file was labeled Sanguis Incognitus. Lombardi claimed some were monks, others aristocrats, a few peasants always ordinary on the surface, but each, he said, was protected, removed from conflict, moved like chess pieces when history required it. In 1938, a photograph surfaced in Warsaw, now preserved in the archives of the Polish resistance. It shows a woman in peasant clothing shielding a group of children during a Nazi raid. What makes the image remarkable is not her courage, but the presence of a Vatican cardinal in the background, standing in deference to her. No record exists of who she was, no family, no name. Just a small note on the back written in Latin, Filia Gabrielis, daughter of Gabriel. The idea of living descendants of angelic origin has always straddled the line between mysticism and madness. But there are patterns, blood anomalies that defy classification, families who survive plagues untouched, women whose pregnancies occur outside statistical or medical probability. One modern researcher who has since ceased public work claimed to have encountered 3 such individuals in Eastern Europe. Each one displayed a rare chromosomal variance not associated with any known condition, but consistent across all cases. He referred to it as the S gene, short for seraphim, and then he disappeared. A curious document in the Vatican's secret archives, long believed lost but briefly photographed during a leak in 2005, bears the seal of Pope Pius IX. It is a memorandum dated 1844 addressed to a body called Custodes Umbrae, or Guardians of the Shadow. The subject, unconfirmed sightings in Alsace. The woman claims no lineage but bears the mark. No further pages are visible. But the mention of the mark echoes reports from other eras, a symbol said to appear briefly at birth, a discoloration near the ribs shaped like an incomplete star, always fading within days. These stories never make the news, but once in a while, something slips through. In 1997, a child was born in southern Spain during a solar eclipse. The hospital staff filed unusual reports, elevated electromagnetic readings in the delivery room, 3 power outages during labor, and the child's temperature registering 2 degrees below normal, yet perfectly healthy. The attending nurse wrote simply, "This child is not like the others." The family was relocated within the year. The hospital burned down in 1999. No files remain. Even within the church, the idea of surviving descendants splits opinions. Some consider it dangerous heresy, an affront to the doctrine of divine uniqueness. Others quietly accept the possibility. After all, Scripture itself speaks of entertaining angels unaware. And perhaps awareness is not the threshold the bloodline requires. One cardinal now deceased once confided to a young seminarian that the bloodline is like a song only some can hear. He believed these descendants were not meant to rule nor to be worshipped, but to bear witness, to carry something forward. Not power, but memory. The question remains, if they exist, do they know what they carry, or have centuries of secrecy and suppression buried even their own awareness of it? Could one walk past you on the street, their gaze calm, their presence unsettling, their existence impossible? And if they are protected by divine hand or by earthly agents, what happens when they are no longer hidden? If one were to come forward to speak, to reveal, would the world listen, or would the noise of disbelief drown them out once more? We may never know. Or perhaps we were never meant to. Because if this bloodline truly survives, if flesh touched by the breath of angels still walks the earth, then the silence is not an accident. It is a covenant. Between heaven and a world not ready to remember. There are silences louder than screams, and none echo more powerfully than the things the Vatican has refused to say for over 1,000 years. Behind closed doors, beneath layers of ritual doctrine and marble corridors, lies not just a hidden history, but a buried fear. One so profound, it shaped the architecture of control itself. It was never just about protecting faith. It was about containing something too dangerous to name. A truth that, if spoken, might unravel not just theology, but the very fabric of religious power. And at the center of that fear is blood. The existence of a sacred lineage, not metaphorical, not symbolic, but literal and traceable, poses an existential threat to the authority the Church has built upon divine uniqueness. If the archangels, those celestial emissaries who were never meant to breed, once mingled with humanity in flesh, then the entire structure of sacred hierarchy trembles. Angels were meant to guide, not create, to intervene, not inhabit, but the evidence scattered like ashes across centuries suggests otherwise. The Vatican's real panic was not rooted in heresy, but in genealogy. If a bloodline tied to beings closer to God than man still flowed through human veins, it would redefine the meaning of sacredness. Holiness would no longer be conferred through ordination or dogma. It would become something inherited, something born, and that could not be controlled. Across the centuries, the Church's suppression tactics evolved from excommunication to execution, from silencing to rewriting. Whole religious movements were dismantled, not for their ideas, but for the bloodlines they may have sheltered. Think of the Cathars, the Gnostics, the Sabians. Their crimes were always painted as doctrinal, yet whispers of divine inheritance trail their ruins. Some scholars now believe the real target was never the belief systems, but the individuals who carried something unnameable inside them. The archives of the Inquisition contain thousands of pages of trial transcripts, most read like predictable condemnations of witches and blasphemers. But a few contain eerie phrasing, repeated references to those accused as marked in the marrow, not of this plane, or carriers of the spark. One particularly chilling entry from a 14th century tribunal in Avignon describes a woman who, when placed near relics, caused them to glow faintly. No confession was extracted. She was burned the next morning. Her ashes were scattered at sea. Internal Vatican memos uncovered by historians, some authenticated, others intercepted anonymously, reveal strategies not only for censorship, but for containment. There are references to linea seraphica, a term that appears only a handful of times, but always in proximity to mentions of relocation, disinheritance, and annulled baptisms. If this lineage exists, it has been hidden with a precision that borders on obsession. Why such terror? Why not absorb it, canonize it, bless it as a miracle? Because if even one drop of angelic blood remains in the world, then the chain of command, the Vatican enforces the top-down hierarchy that defines God. Then angels, then man collapses. The presence of a hybrid disrupts the binary. It suggests heaven and earth are not opposites, but neighbors. Worse still, it suggests heaven can bleed. And when heaven bleeds, theology loses its sharpest weapon: separation. No longer can the sacred be kept distant. No longer can holiness be monopolized. The veil tears not from the top down, as in the Passion, but from the inside out. This is the Vatican's greatest fear. Not scandal, not science, not secularism, but the end of control. Because if this truth were to surface, that angelic beings may have walked among us, left behind descendants, and that these descendants were hunted, protected, or both, the faithful would ask the one question the Church cannot answer without losing its grip. Why didn't you tell us? And behind that, a deeper tremor. If you've hidden this, what else have you buried? How many lives were erased to preserve your silence? How many miracles were snuffed out to avoid one inconvenient truth? There is no doctrine to contain that reckoning. No catechism prepared for it. Some insiders whisper that the Vatican's most secret rooms beyond the archives, behind the sealed vaults, house not just texts, but bones. Preserved remains, not yet declared relics, never to be tested, never to be exhumed. Their DNA may never see daylight, not because of scientific doubt, but because of ecclesiastical fear. And yet, even within the Church, not all are in agreement. There have been those cardinals, monks, archivists who believed the truth should not only be known, but honored. That humanity has always danced closer to the divine than we were told. That if angels left a trace within us, it is not something to fear, but something to cherish. Their voices were quieter, their fates unknown. But perhaps now we are finally ready to listen. And if the silence has been broken, then the bloodline may no longer be hidden. So now, dear listener, let the questions fall away for a moment. Close your eyes if they're not already closed. Let your breath drift like mist along the cathedral arches of the mind. The story is nearly over now, or perhaps it is just beginning again. We've wandered through vaults of history thick with incense and secrecy, along corridors where angels were said to have walked in flesh, through whispers in Scripture, and deeper still into places even the Vatican has tried to forget. We've traced bloodlines not through royal marriages or noble crests, but through symbols tucked in margins, erased saints and heretics who may have carried heaven in their veins. But what does it mean? Truly, if angels once bled, not metaphorically, not as stories to frighten or inspire, but in the most human way, through broken skin and pulsing hearts, through tears that fell not from halos above, but from eyes that saw the world as we do and loved it enough to stay, to leave behind children, a legacy, a trace. Perhaps that is what scared the Vatican most. Not the rebellion of heaven, but its tenderness. The idea that the divine was never above us, but always with us, in us. And if even one child bore the spark of something more, some mix of mortal and celestial, then the lines blur. The hierarchy bends, and the sacred becomes familiar. Maybe that's why ancient texts speak not of dominion but of closeness, of Emmanuel God with us, of visitations not to punish but to plant something, a seed, a lineage, a second Genesis whispered into flesh, and maybe, just maybe, those born of such a union weren't monsters, weren't curses, but mirrors, reminders of what we were meant to be, of the light we carry without even knowing. You've made it far now, through dust and parchment, through whispers and bones, through angels who loved too deeply and a church that feared too much. But the world is quieter now. The moon outside is pale and still, and whatever blood flows through you, be it sacred storied or simply human, it is enough. Let the Vatican keep its vaults. Let the secrets rot in scrolls and stone. Because the truth, if it ever lived, it lives now in memory, in wonder, in you, so rest. The angels are watching, and perhaps one of them was your ancestor.